The first lie was that the Duke was dead. The second was that Clara Whitfield had stolen from him. By the time the bells of Blackthorn Hall struck 10 on that gray November morning, nearly everyone in the house believed both. Clara stood alone in the center of the great entrance hall with 30 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. Servants lined the walls in uneasy silence. Footmen stared at the polished marble floor. Housemaids exchanged nervous glances behind lowered lashes. Even the cook, who had once slipped Clara extra biscuits on difficult days, looked away. Nobody wanted to be seen standing beside the accused. Outside, cold rain tapped softly against the towering windows. Inside, the vast hall felt colder still. At the far end of the room, beneath the enormous portrait of the late Duke Adrian Blackthorn, Lady Margaret Blackthorn sat in a carved walnut chair that had never belonged to her. She looked perfectly at ease, occupying a place that had belonged to someone else. Her black mourning gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Diamonds glittered at her throat despite the recent funeral. Grief did not seem to have diminished her taste for expensive things. "Search her pockets again," Lady Margaret said. Clara tightened her hands at her sides. "You already did. Then perhaps you hid it elsewhere." "I did not take anything." Lady Margaret sighed dramatically. "You see? No remorse at all." A murmur drifted through the servants. Clara kept her spine straight. She had learned years ago that fear only encouraged cruel people. 3 days earlier, the entire county had attended Duke Adrian Blackthorn's memorial service. The coffin had been closed. The speeches had been grand. The tears had flowed generously. According to the official story, the Duke's carriage had plunged into a river nearly 80 miles from Blackthorn Hall during a storm. The current had swept everything away. No body had ever been recovered. Yet somehow society had accepted the explanation with remarkable speed. Too remarkable, Clara thought. She had worked at Blackthorn Hall for 4 years. During that time she had learned many things about powerful people. One of the most important lessons was that truth often disappeared long before a body did. "Tell them what is missing," Lady Margaret said. Beside her stood Mr. Silas Vane, the estate's chief steward. Tall and narrow-faced, he carried himself with the confidence of a man whose authority had recently increased. Clara had never trusted him. The feeling appeared to be mutual. "His Grace's signet ring," Silas announced. "The ring worn by every Duke of Blackthorn for nearly 2 centuries. Another murmur swept through the hall. The ring was secured in the Duke's private study following news of his death. And this morning, one of the maids reported seeing Clara near the study after midnight. Clara immediately looked toward the row of servants. A young maid named Edith lowered her gaze. Clara felt disappointment more than anger. Edith had always been easily frightened. Somebody had likely pressured her. "I walked past the study," Clara said calmly. "I did not enter it." "Convenient." Silas smiled thinly. "The door was locked. Then how could I have taken the ring?" For the first time, several servants exchanged uncertain looks. Clara noticed it immediately. Logic still mattered to some people. Lady Margaret's expression hardened. "Enough." She rose from her chair. The rustle of silk echoed through the cavernous room. "I have no patience for arguments. The facts are obvious." Clara resisted the urge to laugh. Facts were precisely what seemed absent. Lady Margaret descended the shallow staircase leading from the gallery. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble. She stopped only a few feet away. The scent of expensive perfume drifted through the air. "The Duke is gone," she said. "This household requires order, loyalty, discipline." Her gaze swept across the servants. "Anyone who threatens that order threatens Blackthorn Hall itself." Clara remained silent. Lady Margaret turned toward the assembled staff. "Some of you may feel sympathy for her." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched. "That would be a mistake," Lady Margaret continued. "Theft is theft regardless of how pleasant the thief appears." Clara finally looked directly at her. "You know I did not take that ring." A flicker crossed Lady Margaret's face. It vanished almost instantly. "Be careful, girl. I worked here faithfully for 4 years. And now you are dismissed." Clara heard several sharp intakes of breath. Even servants who believed the accusation appeared shocked by the speed of the decision. Lady Margaret had clearly planned this long before entering the hall. "You cannot do that," one elderly footman whispered before quickly falling silent. Lady Margaret's head turned toward him. The man immediately lowered his eyes. Fear spread through the room like a draft beneath a door. Clara understood something then. This was not really about a ring. The ring was simply the excuse. Somebody wanted her gone. The realization settled heavily inside her chest. Not because it frightened her. Because it confirmed suspicions she had been carrying since the day news of the Duke's death arrived. "You will leave immediately," Lady Margaret said. "Your wages for the current week will be paid." Clara blinked. How generous! Several servants nearly gasped. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Mind your tongue." "Why?" Clara asked softly. "You already took my position." The hall fell completely silent. Even the rain seemed to stop. For a moment neither woman moved. Clara could practically feel everyone's anxiety pressing against her. Yet something unexpected happened. The fear that had been building inside her for days suddenly disappeared. Losing a job was frightening. Being falsely accused was humiliating. But there was also freedom hidden inside disaster. She no longer had anything left to lose. Lady Margaret stepped closer. "You should leave with dignity." Clara glanced up toward the giant portrait hanging above them. Duke Adrian Blackthorne gazed down from the canvas with his usual reserved expression. The artist had captured his gray eyes almost perfectly. Observant, unsettling, intelligent. Clara remembered the first day she met him. She had accidentally spilled tea on official correspondence. Most aristocrats would have dismissed her instantly. Instead, he had handed her a clean cloth and asked if she was injured. It had been such a simple question. Yet nobody else in the room had thought to ask it. For years later she still remembered. The memory tightened her throat unexpectedly. He deserved better than whatever was happening now. Clara turned back toward Lady Margaret. "Before I go, may I ask one question?" Lady Margaret looked irritated. "One." Clara's voice remained calm. "If His Grace is truly dead, why is everyone still so afraid of what he left behind?" The effect was immediate. Several servants looked down. Others stared toward the portrait. One maid crossed herself. Even Silas Vane seemed momentarily unsettled. Lady Margaret froze. Only for a second. Yet Clara saw it. Fear. Real fear. Then the older woman laughed. The sound rang hollow against the marble walls. What a dramatic imagination. Perhaps. Clara held her gaze. But fear usually follows truth. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence became almost painful. Finally Lady Margaret pointed toward the front doors. "Leave." Clara nodded once. She would leave. But she would not beg. She would not cry. And she would certainly not apologize for something she had not done. A maid hurried forward carrying Clara's small travel case. Contained nearly everything she owned. A few dresses. 2 books. A silver hairbrush that had belonged to her mother. 4 years of service reduced to a single case. Clara accepted it quietly. As she turned toward the doors, someone touched her sleeve. She looked back. Mrs. Holloway, the elderly housekeeper, stood there with tears in her eyes. "Take care of yourself, dear." Clara managed a faint smile. "I will." The older woman squeezed her hand briefly before stepping away. It was the only kindness anyone dared offer. Clara walked across the hall. Her footsteps echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. She passed beneath the portrait of Duke Adrian Blackthorne one final time. For some reason she slowed. Her gaze lifted toward the painted face. Something felt wrong. Not with the portrait. With everything. The funeral. The accusations. The sudden changes. The growing desperation inside certain people. It all felt wrong. She could not explain why. Only that the pieces refused to fit together. Then she noticed something else. Silas Vane was watching her. Not with satisfaction. With concern. The realization struck her unexpectedly. If he truly believed she was powerless, why look worried? Clara filed the observation away. People revealed more through fear than confidence. She reached the enormous front doors. A footman opened them. Cold wind rushed inside immediately. Rain swept across the stone steps beyond. Gray clouds covered the sky from horizon to horizon. Blackthorn Hall loomed behind her like a sleeping giant. For the first time in 4 years, Clara stepped outside with nowhere to go. The doors began closing. Just before they shut completely, she glanced back one last time. Through the narrowing gap, she saw Lady Margaret speaking urgently to Silas. Neither looked relieved. They looked anxious. Then the doors slammed shut. Clara stood alone in the rain. Water soaked her cloak almost instantly. The road stretched downhill toward the village. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the countryside. She tightened her grip on the travel case and started walking. Behind her, hidden beyond stone walls and locked doors, Blackthorn Hall guarded its secrets. And somewhere deep inside Clara's memory, a quiet question refused to disappear. Why had Duke Adrian Blackthorn warned her only weeks before his death that trust would soon become the most dangerous thing in the world? She did not yet know the answer. But as the rain fell and the great house disappeared behind the mist, one certainty settled into her heart. The story of the dead Duke was not over. It had only just begun. By the time the church clock in Blackthorn Village struck noon, Clara Whitfield had been dismissed for exactly 2 hours, and already the world seemed determined to remind her how quickly a person's life could change. The rain had eased into a cold mist that drifted across the countryside like a pale veil. Her boots were damp. Her shoulders ached from carrying her travel case. Yet she continued walking along the narrow road that wound away from the estate. Behind her, hidden by hills and trees, Blackthorn Hall remained invisible. She was grateful for that. Looking back would not change anything. At least that was what she told herself. The village appeared gradually through the fog. Small stone cottages lined the main street. Smoke rose from chimneys. Shopkeepers swept water from their front steps. A wagon rattled past carrying sacks of grain. Life continued as though nothing remarkable had happened. Clara envied that simplicity. She paused beside the bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. Normally she would have smiled. Today she barely noticed it. Her savings would not last long. Finding work would become necessary soon. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to the same unsettling question. Why had Lady Margaret been so eager to remove her? Clara crossed the village square and entered a small boarding house owned by Mrs. Turner, a widow who occasionally rented rooms to travelers. The woman stood behind a counter polishing glasses when Clara stepped inside. Warm air greeted her immediately. So did curiosity. Mrs. Turner looked up. Clara? Clara forced a smile. Good afternoon. The older woman blinked in surprise. You are not supposed to be here on a weekday. Apparently I am now. Understanding dawned slowly. Mrs. Turner set down the glass. Something happened. Clara nodded. She had no desire to repeat the entire story. News traveled quickly in villages. By evening everyone would know. Mrs. Turner studied her face for a moment. Then she simply said, I have a room available upstairs. Relief washed through Clara. Thank you. You can pay when you are able. Clara opened her mouth to protest. Mrs. Turner raised a hand. You helped my daughter learn to read. Consider this repayment. Emotion tightened Clara's throat unexpectedly. She managed a quiet thank you and carried her case upstairs. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed stood beside a window overlooking the village rooftops. A washstand occupied one corner. A faded quilt covered the mattress. It was not luxurious. It was safe. For the first time since leaving Blackthorn Hall, Clara allowed herself to sit. Silence settled around her. The kind of silence that arrived only when nobody was watching. Nobody judging. Nobody waiting for her to make a mistake. She stared out the window for several minutes. Then her gaze drifted toward the travel case resting near the bed. Something inside it tugged at her memory. Frowning slightly, she knelt beside the case and opened it. Clothes, books, hairbrush. Nothing unusual. Yet the feeling persisted. She searched more carefully. Beneath a folded shawl she found an envelope. Her breath caught. She knew this envelope. Cream-colored paper. Heavy stock. No name written on the front. No seal. Just a simple folded packet. Clara picked it up slowly. The memory returned immediately. 3 weeks earlier Duke Adrian Blackthorn had handed it to her personally. The encounter had occurred late in the evening. Most servants had already retired for the night. Clara had been organizing books in the library when the Duke entered unexpectedly. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. "Miss Whitfield," he had said, "I need a favor." The request alone had surprised her. The Duke rarely asked for favors. "Of course, Your Grace." He had glanced toward the closed door before producing the envelope. "Keep this." Clara remembered staring at it in confusion. "What is it?" "Insurance." "Against what?" A faint smile had touched his face. Not amusement. Resignation. "Against the possibility that I am correct." Clara had waited for an explanation. None came. Instead, he had placed the envelope into her hands. "Do not open it unless circumstances become unusual." She had nearly laughed. "That is not very specific." "You will know." Looking back now, she wished she had pressed him harder. At the time, the conversation seemed strange but harmless. Duke Adrian often carried burdens he never discussed openly. Many powerful men did. Yet now, sitting alone in a rented room after being accused of theft and expelled from his estate, the memory felt entirely different. Clara turned the envelope over. Her pulse quickened. Circumstances had certainly become unusual. The question was whether they were unusual enough. A knock sounded at the door. Clara jumped slightly. "Come in." Mrs. Turner entered carrying a tray. Tea steamed gently from a porcelain pot. Beside it sat 2 slices of bread and a bowl of vegetable soup. "You need something warm." Clara smiled gratefully. "You are very kind." "Nonsense." Mrs. Turner placed the tray on the washstand. Her expression softened. "I heard about the funeral." Clara looked away. So did everyone else. "A tragedy." The older woman hesitated. "He was a good man." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes." After Mrs. Turner departed, Clara sat beside the window and drank the tea. The warmth helped. So did the quiet. Yet the envelope remained on the bed, impossible to ignore. Outside, afternoon faded toward evening. Clouds thickened overhead. Lamps appeared one by one throughout the village. Finally Clara set down her teacup. She picked up the envelope again. "All right, Your Grace," she murmured. "Let us see what you thought was so important." Her fingers slipped beneath the fold. She unfolded the paper carefully. A single sheet rested inside. No lengthy explanation. No elaborate instructions. Only a brief handwritten message in Adrian Blackthorne's unmistakable script. Clara stared at the words. Then she read them again. "Trust no one who mourns me too loudly." For several seconds she simply sat motionless. The sentence seemed absurdly simple, yet something about it sent a chill through her. Beneath the message lay a small sketch of a location. Not a map exactly, more a rough set of directions. Clara recognized the place immediately. St. Aldwyn's Chapel. An abandoned stone chapel approximately 6 miles from Blackthorne Hall. It had not been used regularly in years. Most villagers avoided it. The roof leaked. Ivy covered half the walls. Travelers claimed the surrounding woods felt strange after dark. Clara lowered the page slowly. Why would Adrian send her there? More importantly, why write a message that sounded less like a farewell and more like a warning? She rose and paced the room. Her thoughts raced. Trust no one who mourns me too loudly. Lady Margaret's dramatic tears at the funeral flashed through her mind. So did the endless speeches. The exaggerated grief. The sudden rush to control the estate. Clara stopped beside the window. Her reflection stared back from the glass. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. Yet she did not believe it. Deep down she had sensed something wrong from the beginning. The official story never felt complete. Duke Adrian had been an experienced traveler. Careful man. He did not simply disappear without leaving questions behind. And now there was this letter. This warning. This strange destination. Common sense suggested she should forget all of it. Find employment. Build a new life. Leave Blackthorne Hall and its secrets behind. Unfortunately, Clara had never been particularly talented at ignoring mysteries. Especially mysteries involving people she respected. The church bells rang 6 times. Evening had arrived. Darkness gathered outside. Clara looked toward the map again. 6 miles was not an impossible journey. She could leave now and reach the chapel before night became too deep. Then she immediately rejected the idea. Walking alone through woodland roads after sunset would be foolish. She could visit tomorrow morning. The decision felt reasonable, practical, sensible, which was probably why it lasted less than 10 minutes. By 6:30 she had already packed a lantern, wrapped herself in a heavier cloak, and prepared to leave. Curiosity had defeated caution once again. Downstairs, Mrs. Turner glanced up from her knitting. Going somewhere? Clara hesitated. A short walk. The older woman raised an eyebrow. In this weather? I will not be long. Mrs. Turner clearly doubted that promise. Nevertheless, she nodded. Be careful. Outside, evening mist curled through the streets. Clara followed the village road toward the eastern woods. The farther she walked, the quieter the world became. Houses disappeared. Fields stretched into darkness. The road narrowed. Branches swayed overhead. Somewhere in the distance an owl called softly. Clara tightened her grip on the lantern. She reminded herself repeatedly that she was being irrational. There was probably a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting at the chapel. Perhaps Adrian had hidden legal documents there. Perhaps evidence related to the estate. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet despite every attempt at logic, a strange feeling continued growing inside her. Hope, small, fragile, almost embarrassing. Hope that the story was not finished. Hope that answers still existed. Nearly an hour later, the outline of St. Aldwyn's Chapel emerged through the trees. Moonlight filtered through clouds above, casting pale silver across the weathered stone structure. Ivy climbed the walls. Several windows stood broken. The place looked abandoned exactly as she remembered. Clara approached cautiously. The front door hung slightly open. Wind whispered through the gap. She lifted the lantern higher and stepped inside. Dust covered the floor. Wooden pews sat crooked and neglected. The altar remained intact despite years of neglect. Nothing appeared unusual. Clara exhaled slowly. Perhaps she truly had been chasing ghosts. Then her lantern beam caught something near the front steps. A dark piece of fabric. Frowning, she moved closer. The cloth lay partially hidden beneath a fallen pew. Clara knelt beside it. Her heart began to pound. It was a coat. A man's coat. Expensive. Well-made. Familiar. She knew it instantly. Duke Adrian Blackthorne had worn it dozens of times. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the sleeve. The fabric was damp from age and weather. Along one side ran several dark stains that had long since dried. Clara stared at them. Every sound inside the chapel seemed to vanish. She was no longer looking at a random abandoned garment. She was looking at proof. Proof that Adrian had been here. Proof that the letter meant something. Proof that whatever happened on that road weeks ago was not the entire truth. Slowly, Clara rose to her feet. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The chapel suddenly felt less abandoned than before. Less empty. As though unseen answers lingered in the shadows beyond the lantern light. She turned toward the darkness at the rear of the chapel. "Your Grace," she called softly. Only silence answered. Yet for reasons she could not explain, Clara left St. Aldwyn's Chapel that night more certain than ever of one thing. Somewhere beneath the lies, beneath the funeral, beneath the accusations and the fear, the truth was still alive, and she intended to find it. The coat remained in Clara's hands long after reason suggested she should have set it down. Moonlight spilled through the broken chapel windows and painted pale shapes across the stone floor. Dust drifted through the air. Somewhere beyond the walls, wind moved through the trees with a whispering sound that seemed almost like distant voices. She looked again at the dark stains along the sleeve. They were old, weathered, real. Yet the presence of the coat created more questions than answers. If Duke Adrian Blackthorne had truly died in the river, how had one of his personal coats found its way into an abandoned chapel 6 miles from Blackthorne Hall? Clara carefully folded the garment and placed it over one arm. She examined every corner of the small chapel. The altar, the pews, the narrow side room where priests once prepared for services. Nothing else appeared unusual. No hidden documents. No secret messages. No evidence that anyone had visited recently. Eventually she accepted that remaining there would accomplish nothing. She extinguished her lantern and stepped back into the night. The woods seemed darker than before, yet she no longer felt afraid. Curiosity had replaced fear entirely. By the time she returned to Mrs. Turner's boarding house, the village had gone quiet. Most windows were dark. Only a few lanterns still glowed behind curtains. Mrs. Turner sat beside the fireplace reading when Clara entered. The older woman looked up immediately. "You were gone longer than a short walk." Clara removed her damp cloak. "I suppose I was." Mrs. Turner studied her face. "Did you find whatever you were looking for?" Clara hesitated. She had no wish to sound foolish. Yet hiding the truth felt equally impossible. "I found something strange." The older woman closed her book. "Those are usually the things worth finding." Clara almost smiled. "Perhaps." She carried the coat upstairs and laid it across the bed. For a long time she simply stared at it. Sleep refused to come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, new questions emerged. Why had Adrian given her the letter? Why choose her instead of a solicitor, a family friend, or one of his senior staff? What had he suspected before his disappearance? Most importantly, why had he written those words? "Trust no one who mourns me too loudly." Shortly before dawn, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The following morning arrived bright and clear. Sunlight streamed through the window. For the first time in days, the storm clouds had vanished. Clara dressed quickly and carried the coat downstairs. Mrs. Turner glanced at it while preparing breakfast. "That looks expensive." It was. The older woman raised an eyebrow. "Was?" Clara sat across from her. "It belonged to His Grace." Mrs. Turner nearly dropped the spoon in her hand. "The Duke?" Clara nodded. "I found it last night." Silence followed. Then Mrs. Turner slowly lowered herself into a chair. "Where?" Clara told her about St. Aldwyn's Chapel. The older woman listened without interruption. When the story ended, she remained quiet for several seconds. "That is not normal," she finally said. "No. And you think it means something." "I know it means something." Mrs. Turner folded her arms. "Then what will you do?" Clara looked toward the window. The answer arrived before the question fully settled. "I am going back." "To the chapel?" "No." Clara's voice softened. "To Blackthorn Hall." Mrs. Turner stared at her. "That seems remarkably unwise." Clara laughed despite herself. "You may be right. They threw you out." "I know. They accused you of theft." "I remember." The older woman sighed. "Then why?" Clara thought about the letter, the coat, Lady Margaret's fear, Silas Vane's anxiety, the rushed funeral. None of it felt complete. None of it felt finished. "Because someone is lying," she said quietly. "And because His Grace trusted me with something before he disappeared." Mrs. Turner regarded her thoughtfully. "Then perhaps he had a reason." By late morning Clara stood at the edge of the Blackthorn estate. She remained hidden behind a row of oak trees overlooking the main drive. The familiar sight tightened something inside her chest. Blackthorn Hall rose above the landscape exactly as it always had. Gray stone, tall windows, towering chimneys. Yet the house felt different now. Colder somehow. Less like a home and more like a fortress. Activity filled the grounds. Wagons arrived carrying supplies. Gardeners worked along the southern path. Servants moved in and out through the side entrance. Life continued despite the Duke's absence. Clara watched carefully. Nearly an hour passed before she noticed something unusual. Two men she did not recognize emerged from the front doors. Neither wore servant uniforms. Both carried leather document cases. They spoke briefly with Silas Vane before climbing into a waiting carriage. Clara narrowed her eyes. Legal representatives, perhaps. Or accountants. Whatever their purpose, their visit appeared important. She remained hidden until the carriage departed. Then she followed the road toward the village. If answers existed, they would not be found by staring at the estate from a distance. Information lived among people, and people talked. Her first stop was the blacksmith's shop. The owner, Mr. Finch, had supplied horseshoes to Blackthorn Hall for years. Clara purchased a small loaf of bread she did not need simply to begin a conversation. Within minutes she learned that Lady Margaret had ordered a complete inventory of the estate's assets. The next stop was the tailor, then the apothecary, then the general store. Piece by piece a pattern began emerging. Lady Margaret was moving quickly, too quickly. New financial reviews, meetings with solicitors, replacement staff arriving from London, even discussions regarding future changes to estate management. It was as though she intended to secure permanent control immediately. Clara left the general store deep in thought. As she crossed the village square, a familiar voice called her name. Miss Whitfield. She turned. Mrs. Holloway stood near the church gates. The elderly housekeeper looked older than Clara remembered. Exhaustion shadowed her face. Relief appeared the moment she recognized Clara. Mrs. Holloway. The older woman hurried forward. Thank heavens. Clara frowned. Is something wrong? Mrs. Holloway glanced around nervously before lowering her voice. Not here. 10 minutes later they sat alone inside a small tea room near the edge of the village. Mrs. Holloway wrapped trembling hands around a cup. Clara waited patiently. Finally the older woman spoke. The house is changing. Clara nodded. I noticed. It is worse than you think. The housekeeper looked toward the window. People are disappearing. Clara stiffened. What do you mean? Not literally. They are being dismissed. Mrs. Holloway swallowed hard. Anyone who worked closely with His Grace is being removed. Clara's pulse quickened. How many? 7 so far. The answer landed heavily. 7 trusted employees gone within days. That was not coincidence. That was strategy. Why? Clara asked. Mrs. Holloway shook her head. Nobody knows. We are all afraid to ask. Silence settled between them. Clara considered everything she had learned. Then a new thought emerged. The study. Mrs. Holloway blinked. What about it? Is it still locked? Yes. Clara leaned forward. Has anyone entered since I left? The older woman hesitated. Then she nodded. Lady Margaret. How often? Several times. Clara felt her heartbeat accelerate. Alone. Usually. Another piece slid into place. Not enough to reveal the full picture, but enough to confirm her instincts. Something inside that room mattered. Something important enough to justify lies, dismissals, and fear. Mrs. Holloway reached into her reticule. There is one more thing. She placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. Clara stared at it. What is this? A copy. The older woman's voice dropped even lower. I should not have taken it. Clara unfolded the paper carefully. At first glance it appeared to be an official estate notice. Then she reached the signature line. Her breath caught. Adrian Blackthorne's name appeared at the bottom. The signature looked correct. Yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. Clara had organized correspondence for years. She had seen the Duke's handwriting hundreds of times. This signature resembled his, but it lacked certain details, certain habits, certain natural movements of the pen. It was a convincing imitation, not the genuine article. Slowly Clara lowered the document. Where did this come from? The solicitor's office. Mrs. Holloway's expression turned grim. Lady Margaret plans to present it next week. Clara stared at the page. A cold realization settled over her. The document was not merely suspicious. It was dangerous, because if it succeeded, everything belonging to Adrian Blackthorne could pass into the wrong hands. The tea room suddenly felt very small. Outside, sunlight warmed the village streets. Ordinary people continued ordinary lives. Yet Clara knew something they did not. The story everyone accepted was beginning to unravel. And somewhere beneath the carefully arranged grief, beneath the forged signatures and quiet dismissals, someone was desperately trying to make sure the truth never surfaced. She folded the document carefully and slipped it into her reticule. Then she looked directly at Mrs. Holloway. I think His Grace knew this was coming. The older woman stared at her. You believe that? Clara thought of the letter, the warning, the hidden coat, the fear she had seen in Lady Margaret's eyes. Yes, she said softly. I do. And for the first time since leaving Blackthorne Hall, she began to wonder whether Adrian Blackthorne had not simply anticipated betrayal. Perhaps he had been preparing for it. 3 days later, Clara discovered what it felt like to become a ghost in her own county. The first rejection came from the Hawthorne estate. The second came from a merchant's household in the neighboring village. By the end of the week, 5 separate employers had politely informed her that the position she sought was no longer available. None of them met her eyes when they said it. None of them sounded convincing. One woman even apologized before closing the door. Clara understood the truth long before anyone admitted it. Her reputation had arrived ahead of her. The accusation from Blackthorn Hall was spreading. The dismissed maid, the alleged thief, the servant who had supposedly stolen from a dead duke. People loved a scandal, especially one that allowed them to feel superior. By the following Monday, whispers followed her through the village streets. They were never loud enough to confront, never cruel enough to challenge directly. Yet they existed everywhere. A lowered voice, a curious glance, a conversation that stopped when she entered a room. Clara carried herself with dignity. It was all she could do. Each evening she returned to Mrs. Turner's boarding house exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly convinced that somebody wanted her isolated. On the 7th day after her dismissal, she sat alone in the dining room studying the questionable estate document Mrs. Holloway had given her. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the table. Outside, children laughed somewhere in the village square. Inside, Clara traced the forged signature with careful eyes. The differences remained subtle. Most people would never notice them. She did. Adrian always formed the final stroke of his surname with a slight upward angle. The signature on this document curved downward instead. It was a tiny discrepancy, yet it transformed certainty into suspicion. A knock sounded at the front door. Moments later, Mrs. Turner entered carrying a folded newspaper. Her expression was troubled. "You should see this." Clara accepted the paper. The headline immediately caught her attention. It announced an upcoming gathering at Blackthorn Hall, an official estate assembly. Solicitors, local landowners, business partners, and neighboring aristocratic families would attend. The purpose seemed simple. Lady Margaret intended to present new administrative arrangements for the future of the estate. Clara felt a cold sensation settle in her stomach. "It is happening sooner than I expected." Mrs. Turner sat opposite her. "What is?" Clara lowered the paper. "Whatever this is, whatever she has been planning." The older woman frowned. "You think the document is connected?" "I know it is." Clara stared through the window. "She is moving too quickly." Mrs. Turner remained quiet. She had learned not to dismiss Clara's instincts. Thus far, those instincts had proven remarkably accurate. Later that afternoon, Clara met Mrs. Holloway again. This time they walked through the church garden where nobody could easily overhear them. Fallen leaves covered the pathways. A cool breeze drifted through the iron gates. Mrs. Holloway looked increasingly anxious. "Another 2 servants were dismissed yesterday." Clara stopped walking. "Who?" "The head gardener and the stable supervisor." The news struck her harder than expected. Both men had worked for Adrian for more than a decade. Loyal employees, trusted employees. What reason was given? Mrs. Holloway laughed bitterly. "Restructuring." Clara resumed walking slowly. The pattern continued. Remove everyone who knew Adrian best. Replace them with new people. Control information. Control access. Control the narrative. "Has anyone challenged her?" Clara asked. "No." Mrs. Holloway's answer came immediately. "People are frightened." Clara could not blame them. Wealth carried influence. Influence carried consequences. Most people could not afford to oppose someone controlling an estate as large as Blackthorn Hall. They reached the far end of the garden where a stone bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree. Mrs. Holloway lowered herself onto the seat with a weary sigh. "There is something else." Clara looked at her. The older woman's hands twisted together nervously. They searched the Duke's private rooms. Clara's attention sharpened instantly. "When?" "2 nights ago." "Who?" "Lady Margaret and Mr. Vane." The answer deepened Clara's concern. "Did they find anything?" Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "I do not know. But they remained inside for hours." Clara thought about the hidden letter, the coat in the chapel, Adrian's warning. It seemed increasingly likely that others were searching for something as well. The difference was that they already knew what they wanted. Clara still did not. That realization bothered her. By the time she returned to the boarding house, dusk had settled across the village. Lamps glowed warmly behind windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Ordinary life continued all around her. Yet Clara felt increasingly trapped outside it. The following morning delivered another blow. A local shopkeeper who had always greeted her kindly suddenly became distant. A woman she once taught to read crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. Even the baker hesitated before accepting her money. Clara maintained her composure until she reached the edge of the village. Then she stopped beside a stone wall overlooking the fields. For several minutes she simply stood there, alone. The injustice hurt more than she wanted to admit. Not because strangers doubted her. Because she had spent years earning trust one small act at a time. Now that trust was evaporating faster than morning fog. You look as though you are considering declaring war on civilization. Clara turned. An elderly man stood a few yards away carrying a fishing pole. Reverend Thomas Ellsworth. The village pastor. He had known her since childhood. Clara managed a weak smile. Only a small portion of it. The Reverend joined her beside the wall. Neither spoke immediately. Silence felt easier. Eventually he said, "I never believed the accusations." Clara looked at him. The simple statement nearly undid her. "Thank you. Truth tends to survive longer than rumors." He rested both hands on the top of his walking stick. "The difficulty lies in waiting." Clara stared across the fields. "I am beginning to wonder whether waiting is enough." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps Providence is preparing you for action." The words lingered with her long after he departed. That evening Clara reviewed everything she knew. The letter, the chapel, the coat, the dismissals, the forged signature, the upcoming estate assembly. None of it formed a complete picture. Yet one conclusion had become unavoidable. Lady Margaret was preparing to present something official, something significant, something she wanted accepted without scrutiny. The next morning, rain returned. Heavy clouds darkened the sky. Clara spent several hours helping Mrs. Turner around the boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. Physical work usually helped organize her thoughts. Today it only produced more questions. Around noon, a carriage arrived outside. Clara glanced through the window casually. Then she froze. The blackthorn crest decorated the carriage door. Her pulse immediately accelerated. A liveried footman stepped down and approached the entrance. Moments later a knock echoed through the building. Mrs. Turner exchanged a worried glance with Clara before opening the door. The footman removed his hat respectfully. "I am looking for Miss Clara Whitfield." Every instinct told Clara to leave through the back entrance immediately. Instead she stepped forward. "I am Clara Whitfield." The man handed her a sealed envelope. "A message, miss." "From whom?" The footman hesitated. "Mr. Silas Vane." Clara accepted the envelope cautiously. The man bowed and departed without another word. Rain drummed against the windows as the carriage rolled away. Mrs. Turner stared at the envelope as though it might explode. "That cannot be good." Clara suspected the same. Slowly she broke the seal. A single page rested inside. She unfolded it carefully. Her eyes moved across the neat handwriting. Then she read the message again. And again. Mrs. Turner leaned forward. "What does it say?" Clara lowered the paper. A strange mixture of surprise and suspicion settled inside her chest. "It is an invitation." "To what?" Clara looked toward the rain-streaked window. Far beyond the village, Blackthorn Hall waited beneath the storm clouds. "To return to the estate." Mrs. Turner stared at her. "Why would they invite you back?" Clara's gaze dropped to the letter once more. One sentence stood out above all the others. "Miss Whitfield's presence is requested during next week's formal estate assembly." The wording was polite, respectful even, yet Clara recognized something hidden beneath the courtesy. Urgency, necessity, perhaps fear. Slowly she folded the letter. "I do not know why they want me there." Her voice softened. "But I think they have just made a mistake." Because for the first time since her dismissal, Blackthorn Hall was not pushing her away. It was pulling her back. And Clara had a growing suspicion that whatever awaited her inside those walls was connected to the very secret Adrian Blackthorn had tried so desperately to protect. The invitation sat on Clara's bedside table for 2 full days before she made her decision. Not because she feared returning to Blackthorn Hall. Fear had largely burned away during the past 2 weeks. What remained was caution. Every instinct told her the invitation was not an act of goodwill. Nobody who had wanted her gone suddenly desired her company. Yet refusing to attend might mean losing the best opportunity she would ever have to learn the truth. On the morning of the estate assembly, she rose before sunrise. Pale gold light crept across the rooftops outside Mrs. Turner's boarding house. The village remained quiet. Even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness. Clara dressed carefully. Not as a servant, not as a guest, simply as herself. Her navy blue gown was modest but neat. Her dark cloak protected against the lingering chill. Before leaving, she slipped Adrian's letter into her reticule alongside the suspicious estate document Mrs. Holloway had obtained. Both felt important. Both felt unfinished. Downstairs, Mrs. Turner stood waiting with a basket. "You are leaving without breakfast if I do not intervene." Clara smiled. "I am not certain I could eat." "Then pretend." The older woman pressed a wrapped roll into her hand. "You think better when you are not hungry." Clara accepted it gratefully. "Thank you." Mrs. Turner studied her face. "Be careful." "I will. And if anyone tries to make you doubt yourself, remember something." Clara paused near the door. "What?" Mrs. Turner folded her arms. "Liars often become angry when someone refuses to believe them." The advice stayed with Clara long after she departed. The road to Blackthorn Hall seemed shorter than usual, perhaps because anticipation occupied every thought. By mid-morning, the estate appeared beyond the hills. Carriages lined the circular drive. Horses stamped patiently beside polished coaches. Liveried servants hurried between entrances carrying luggage, documents, and trays of refreshments. The gathering was larger than Clara expected. Wealthy landowners, solicitors, local officials, business associates. Nearly everyone with influence in the county appeared to be attending. Lady Margaret had chosen her audience carefully. Clara approached the front steps slowly. Several conversations quieted as she passed. Curious eyes followed her. She recognized the expressions immediately: surprise, suspicion, interest. The dismissed maid had become a topic of conversation. Nobody expected her return. A young footman opened the doors. Unlike the others, he seemed nervous rather than judgmental. "Miss Whitfield." Clara nodded politely. "Good morning." He stepped aside. "They are expecting you." The words sent a faint chill down her spine. Inside, Blackthorn Hall looked exactly as she remembered. The soaring ceilings, the marble floors, the enormous staircase sweeping upward beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet something fundamental had changed. The warmth was gone. Not physical warmth. Emotional warmth. The house felt watched, controlled, measured. Clara crossed the entrance hall and immediately noticed several familiar faces among the staff. Most avoided eye contact. A few offered discreet nods. Others looked relieved to see her. The reactions told her more than words could. Tension had settled deeply into the estate. "Miss Whitfield." The voice came from behind her. Clara turned. Silas Vane approached wearing his usual immaculate suit. His expression remained carefully pleasant. Too pleasant. "Mr. Vane." He offered a shallow smile. "Thank you for accepting the invitation. I was curious." "Naturally." His gaze lingered briefly on her face. "Lady Margaret hopes this gathering will put certain unfortunate rumors to rest." Clara almost laughed. "Does she?" "Indeed." Something flickered behind his polite expression. Anxiety. It vanished quickly. "The assembly will begin shortly." Clara folded her hands. "Then perhaps you can explain why my presence is suddenly required." For the first time, Silas hesitated. Only for a moment. Certain administrative matters involve former employees. The explanation sounded rehearsed. Clara immediately recognized it as nonsense. Apparently, Silas realized she did as well. His smile tightened. "If you will excuse me." He departed before she could ask another question. Clara watched him disappear into the crowd. Whatever was happening today, Silas was uncomfortable. That alone made the journey worthwhile. The next hour passed slowly. Guests gathered throughout the drawing rooms. Conversations drifted through the halls. Servants circulated with silver trays. Clara remained near the edge of the main gallery, observing. It was a skill she had perfected during years of service. Powerful people often revealed themselves when they believed nobody important was listening. Near noon, Lady Margaret finally appeared. Silence spread through the room almost immediately. She descended the grand staircase dressed in elegant black silk. Pearls gleamed at her throat. Her expression projected dignified sorrow. Anyone unfamiliar with recent events might have mistaken her for a grieving relative carrying an impossible burden. Clara knew better. So did several others, judging by their skeptical expressions. Lady Margaret greeted guests warmly. She accepted condolences. She thanked supporters. She played her role flawlessly. Yet Clara noticed something unusual. The older woman kept scanning the room. Not openly, not obviously, but repeatedly, as though searching for someone, or confirming the absence of someone. The observation lingered in Clara's mind. Shortly afterward, the formal assembly began. Guests moved into the great ballroom. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform near the far wall. Estate ledgers, legal papers, and account books sat neatly arranged atop a long table. Everything appeared official, deliberate, carefully prepared. Clara selected a seat near the rear. From there she could watch everyone. Lady Margaret opened with a speech. She spoke about responsibility, stability, continuity. She praised the late Duke's legacy. She emphasized the need for strong leadership during uncertain times. The audience listened politely. Clara noticed several people exchanging skeptical glances. Lady Margaret's performance impressed some, not all. After nearly 20 minutes, the legal portion began. A solicitor rose and presented various documents. Financial summaries, estate inventories, management plans. Most seemed legitimate. Then came the document, the forged one. Clara recognized it instantly. The same signature, the same subtle inaccuracies. The solicitor cleared his throat. This declaration reflects His Grace's final administrative wishes. Clara's attention sharpened. Around the room, guests leaned forward. The solicitor began reading. According to the document, Adrian had intended Lady Margaret to oversee significant portions of the estate indefinitely. Expanded authority, expanded control, expanded influence. Exactly as Clara expected. What she did not expect was the reaction from several attendees. A few looked surprised. One elderly landowner frowned openly. Another whispered something to his wife. Doubt existed. Good. Clara listened carefully until the reading concluded. Then she stood. The movement immediately attracted attention. Conversations stopped. The solicitor paused. Lady Margaret's smile vanished. Clara felt every eye in the room settle upon her. Her heart pounded. Yet her voice remained calm. "I have a question." Silence greeted the statement. The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "And you are?" "Clara Whitfield." Recognition spread rapidly. Whispers followed. Lady Margaret looked as though she had swallowed something unpleasant. "This is highly irregular," she said. Clara ignored her. Her gaze remained fixed on the document. Would someone explain why the signature differs from His Grace's standard correspondence? The room froze. Complete silence. The solicitor blinked. Lady Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "That accusation is outrageous." Clara reached into her reticule. "I brought examples." Several guests leaned forward. Interest replaced boredom immediately. Clara withdrew copies of genuine correspondence she had organized while working at the estate. The differences were subtle but visible. She pointed them out carefully, methodically, respectfully. Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. The solicitor accepted the documents and compared them himself. His frown deepened. Lady Margaret's composure began to crack. Only slightly, yet Clara saw it. So did others. "This proves nothing," Lady Margaret snapped. "Handwriting changes. Sometimes, Clara agreed. But not usually overnight. More murmurs. More uncertainty. The atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically. Not yet. But enough. Lady Margaret recognized the danger immediately. Her gaze turned icy. Miss Whitfield. Clara met her eyes. Yes. You were dismissed from this estate for theft. The words echoed through the ballroom. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Clara had expected the attack. I was accused. Because evidence existed. Then where is the missing ring? The question landed harder than she intended. Silence followed once again. Lady Margaret stared at her. For a moment neither woman moved. Then Lady Margaret smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. You continue to chase fantasies. Clara almost responded. Then she noticed something beyond the ballroom windows. A movement outside. Brief. Fleeting. A figure crossing the distant gardens. Someone wearing a dark hooded cloak. The sight lasted only a second before disappearing behind a row of hedges. Yet something about it caught her attention instantly. The height, the posture, the way the person moved. Familiar. Very familiar. Clara's breath caught. When she looked back toward the window, the figure was gone. Had she imagined it? Perhaps. Yet unease settled over her. The assembly continued. Arguments followed. Discussions intensified. Guests debated the document's authenticity. Lady Margaret attempted to regain control. The solicitor requested additional review before any final decisions. By late afternoon, no resolution had been reached. Officially, the matter remained pending. Unofficially, Clara had achieved something far more important. She had introduced doubt. As attendees departed, conversations buzzed throughout the halls. Questions multiplied. Certainty weakened. For the first time, Lady Margaret no longer appeared untouchable. As evening approached, Clara left the estate on foot. She needed air, distance, time to think. The road toward the village wound through open countryside. Shadows stretched across the fields. The sky glowed orange and gold above the horizon. She had traveled perhaps half a mile when she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate. Clara turned. Nobody stood there. Only the empty road. Yet the sensation persisted. Someone was nearby, watching. She resumed walking. The feeling grew stronger. A minute later, two unfamiliar men emerged from a side path ahead. Neither looked threatening, yet neither moved aside. Clara slowed. Instinct immediately sounded an alarm. The men exchanged glances. One stepped forward. Miss Whitfield. Clara's pulse quickened. Yes. We were hoping for a word. Before she could respond, another sound cut through the evening air. The sharp crack of a branch somewhere within the trees. Both men looked toward the woods. Their expressions changed instantly. Concern. Confusion. Then, without explanation, they turned and walked away. Quickly. Almost urgently. Clara stood frozen. The road fell silent once more. For several seconds she could hear only her own heartbeat. Then a new figure emerged from the shadows beneath the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, hidden beneath a dark hooded cloak. Clara stared. The stranger stopped approximately 20 feet away. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The fading sunlight touched the edge of the hood. For the briefest moment, she saw a familiar line of a jaw. A familiar posture. A familiar presence she had not felt since before the funeral. Then the stranger stepped backward into the trees and vanished. Clara remained rooted to the road long after the figure disappeared. Her heart hammered against her ribs, because for one impossible second, she had been certain of something. The man she had just seen moved exactly like Adrian Blackthorne. Clara did not remember walking the rest of the way back to the village. One moment she stood frozen on the road staring into the trees. The next she found herself crossing the square beneath a sky turning deep blue with approaching night. Every thought circled the same impossible conclusion. She knew how Adrian Blackthorne moved. For years of working within the estate had taught her countless small details that others never noticed. The Duke carried himself with unusual control. His stride was measured, efficient, deliberate. Even when hurried, he never appeared rushed. The stranger on the road had moved exactly the same way. By the time she reached Mrs. Turner's boarding house, uncertainty had become frustration. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Warm firelight filled the dining room. Mrs. Turner looked up immediately from her sewing. One glance at Clara's face was enough. Something happened. Clara removed her cloak slowly. "I think I saw him." Silence settled over the room. Mrs. Turner lowered the fabric in her hands. "The Duke." Clara nodded. "Or someone who moves exactly like him." The older woman remained quiet for several moments. Then she asked the question Clara had been avoiding. "Do you believe he is alive?" Clara stared into the fire. The answer should have been simple. Instead it felt enormous. Dangerous. "I do not know what I believe anymore." That night's sleep proved impossible. Every time Clara closed her eyes, she saw the hooded figure standing at the edge of the trees. The memory refused to fade. Shortly after midnight she rose from bed and crossed to the window. The village slept peacefully beneath the moonlight. Nothing moved outside. Yet she could not shake the feeling that events were accelerating. The assembly had changed everything. Questions now existed publicly. Doubt had entered conversations that once contained certainty. If Lady Margaret had hoped to strengthen her position, the plan had partially failed. And if Adrian Blackthorne truly remained alive somewhere, then he had likely been watching. The thought lingered until dawn. The following morning arrived cold and bright. Clara spent several hours helping Mrs. Turner organize supplies. Physical activity usually settled her mind. Today it did little. Around noon, a visitor arrived unexpectedly. Clara heard voices near the entrance. A moment later, Mrs. Turner appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her expression carried equal parts surprise and concern. "There is someone asking for you." Clara dried her hands. "Who?" He would not say. A faint chill traveled through her. Carefully she crossed the boarding house and entered the front parlor. The room stood empty. For one confused second she thought the visitor had already departed. Then a voice spoke from the corner near the window. "You came to the assembly." Clara froze. Every muscle in her body tightened. Slowly she turned. A man stood partially hidden by the shadows. He wore a dark traveling coat. A broad-brimmed hat obscured much of his face. Yet none of that mattered. Clara knew the voice instantly. Her breath caught. The world seemed to narrow until only the man remained. For several seconds neither spoke. Then he removed the hat. Gray eyes met hers. Familiar eyes. Impossible eyes. Clara gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. "Your Grace." Adrian Blackthorne looked older than she remembered. Not by years, by experience. His face appeared leaner, more tired. A faint scar crossed his temple near the hairline. Yet he was unmistakably himself. Alive, real, standing less than 10 feet away. Clara stared at him in complete silence. She had imagined this moment repeatedly during recent weeks. Anger, relief, shock, gratitude. None of those emotions prepared her for reality. Adrian studied her carefully. His expression remained controlled. Yet something vulnerable flickered briefly behind his composure. "You are not surprised enough." Clara laughed once. The sound carried no amusement. "I found your coat in an abandoned chapel." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Fair point." Then the smile vanished. Seriousness returned immediately. "I owe you an explanation." Clara folded her arms. "Several, actually." Adrian nodded. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Finally Clara spoke first. "Are you truly alive?" The question sounded absurd the moment it left her lips. Adrian answered anyway. "Last I checked." She should have laughed. Instead, emotion tightened her throat. Weeks of uncertainty crashed together all at once. "Do you have any idea what happened after you disappeared?" His expression darkened. "Some of it. I lost my position." "I know. I lost my reputation." "I know." Clara stepped closer. "People think I am a thief." Adrian lowered his gaze briefly. The movement startled her. He looked guilty. Truly guilty. "I heard what they did to you." His voice softened. "And I have not slept well since." The honesty in the statement stole her next response. For a moment neither spoke. Firelight flickered across the room. Outside, Distant wagon wheels rattled along the village street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Adrian finally gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Clara remained standing. "Not until you tell me why everyone buried an empty coffin." The question hung between them. Adrian exhaled slowly. Then he began. 3 weeks before the supposed accident, he had discovered irregularities within estate finances. Small discrepancies at first, then larger ones. Money moving between accounts without authorization. Documents altered. Records disappearing. Nothing dramatic enough to attract public attention, yet enough to raise concern. He initiated a private investigation. The deeper he looked, the more troubling the situation became. Several trusted advisors warned him to proceed carefully. One even suggested that people close to the estate might be involved. Clara listened without interruption. "Lady Margaret?" she asked. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "I suspected her. I did not have proof." "And the accident?" His jaw tightened. "I was traveling to meet someone who claimed to possess evidence." Clara leaned forward. "What happened?" Adrian hesitated. Not because he wished to avoid the answer, because he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "The carriage never reached its destination." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Someone stopped you." "Yes." Adrian looked toward the window. "After that, circumstances became complicated." It was an intentionally incomplete explanation. Clara recognized the deflection immediately. "Complicated? Very. That is not an answer." A surprising spark of amusement appeared in his eyes. "No, it is not." Clara almost smiled despite herself. The familiar exchange reminded her painfully of old conversations at Blackthorn Hall. Adrian had always possessed a frustrating talent for withholding information while technically remaining truthful. The amusement faded quickly. "Certain people believed I was dead." His voice grew quieter. "When I realized that, I made a decision." Clara understood immediately. "You stayed hidden." Adrian nodded. "If I returned immediately, whoever orchestrated everything would simply adjust their plans. Remaining unseen offered opportunities. While everyone else mourned you." The words escaped before she could stop them. Adrian accepted the criticism without protest. "Yes." Clara turned away. Anger finally surfaced. Not explosive anger. Something deeper. More personal. "You should have told me." Silence followed. She immediately regretted speaking. The statement sounded more emotional than intended. Adrian did not seem offended. If anything, he looked troubled. "I wanted to." Clara faced him again. "Then why did you not?" Adrian held her gaze. The answer arrived quietly. "Because the fewer people who knew, the safer they remained." Clara wanted to argue, yet part of her understood. The logic was sound. Unfortunately, logic did not erase the past several weeks. "You trusted me with the letter." "Yes. But not the truth." Adrian looked away briefly. "There is a difference." Another silence settled between them. This one felt less hostile, more complicated. Eventually Clara sank into a chair. Emotional exhaustion replaced anger. Adrian remained standing. "The assembly changed things," he said. "Your challenge forced delays." Clara looked up sharply. "You were there." It was not a question. Adrian nodded once. "I watched." The confirmation sent a strange sensation through her chest. "The man in the garden." "Yes." "And the man on the road." "Also yes." Clara shook her head. "You could have spoken to me." "Not safely." His answer came immediately. "The two men who approached you were not there by coincidence." Clara remembered them at once. "Who were they?" "I am still determining that." The statement carried enough seriousness to silence further questions. Adrian crossed to the fireplace. For a moment he simply stared into the flames. Then he said something unexpected. "You should not have returned to Blackthorn Hall." Clara blinked. "Excuse me?" "You became visible. You invited me." "I know." Frustration flashed across his face. "And it was a mistake." Clara stared at him. "That makes absolutely no sense." Adrian rubbed a hand across his forehead. For the first time since arriving, he appeared genuinely tired. Certain people underestimated you when you were a servant. His gaze lifted to hers. They are not underestimating you anymore. The realization settled heavily between them. Clara suddenly understood. The invitation had not been intended to strengthen her position. It had been meant to control her, to place her within reach, to observe her, to measure what she knew. Adrian continued quietly. The moment you challenged that document, you became a problem. Fire crackled softly in the silence that followed. Clara considered everything she had learned. Adrian was alive. The conspiracy was real. The danger had not ended. If anything, it had increased. Yet one question remained. Perhaps the most important question of all. Why me? Adrian frowned slightly. What do you mean? Clara rose slowly from the chair. You left the letter with me. You trusted me with a warning. Out of everyone in Blackthorn Hall, why choose me? For the first time, Adrian seemed caught off guard. His answer did not arrive immediately. When it finally came, it was almost too quiet to hear. Because I knew you would not stop looking for the truth. Clara stared at him. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Something shifted in the room. Not romance. Not yet. Something older. Trust. Recognition. A silent understanding that had existed for years without either of them fully acknowledging it. Then a sharp knock sounded at the front door downstairs. Both immediately turned toward the sound. Adrian's expression changed at once. Every trace of warmth vanished. Alertness replaced it. Another knock echoed through the boarding house. Louder this time. More insistent. Clara felt tension surge through the room. Adrian moved toward the rear hallway. Do not tell anyone I was here. Wait. He paused. For one brief moment his gray eyes met hers again. I am sorry, Clara. Then he disappeared through the back entrance. Seconds later, Mrs. Turner appeared in the doorway looking pale. There are 3 men asking questions outside. Clara's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the empty hallway where Adrian had vanished. Whatever game had been unfolding in secret was no longer staying hidden. And for the first time, she realized just how many people might be searching for the same man. The 3 men remained outside for less than 10 minutes. Yet those 10 minutes changed everything. Clara stood beside the parlor window while Mrs. Turner answered questions at the front door. She could not hear every word. Only fragments carried through the hallway. Polite voices, careful inquiries, repeated references to travelers. When the visitors finally departed, Mrs. Turner locked the door and leaned against it with visible relief. Who were they? Clara asked. The older woman crossed her arms. They claimed to be looking for a missing business associate. Clara raised an eyebrow. And you believed that? Not for a second. Mrs. Turner lowered her voice. One of them kept staring toward the rear entrance. Clara immediately glanced toward the hallway where Adrian had disappeared. Her pulse quickened. If those men had arrived only minutes earlier, they might have seen him. The possibility settled heavily in her thoughts. By evening, she had reached a conclusion she could no longer avoid. Remaining passive was no longer an option. Adrian needed evidence. Lady Margaret needed exposure. The truth needed proof. And proof would never appear on its own. The following morning, Clara left the village before sunrise. A thin layer of mist covered the fields. Dew shimmered across the grass. The countryside appeared peaceful, almost innocent. Yet beneath that calm surface, secrets continued moving through Blackthorn Hall. She intended to find them. Her destination was not the main house. Instead, she headed toward a cluster of cottages located near the northern edge of the estate. Several former employees lived there. People who knew the Duke. People who might have noticed things others missed. Her first visit was to Arthur Bell, the former head gardener. The elderly man answered the door carrying a watering can. Surprise crossed his weathered face. Miss Whitfield. Good morning, Mr. Bell. He invited her inside immediately. The small cottage smelled faintly of soil and fresh herbs. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Clara explained recent events carefully. She omitted Adrian's survival. That secret remained too dangerous. Yet she spoke openly about the forged document and the unusual dismissals. Arthur listened without interruption. Finally, he nodded slowly. I knew something was wrong. Clara leaned forward. Why? The gardener set down his teacup. 3 weeks before his grace disappeared, he ordered a complete survey of the northern boundary. Clara frowned. That seems ordinary. Not when he had already approved one 6 months earlier. Arthur's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. He spent hours reviewing maps afterward. Another piece slid into place. Did he say why? No. The answer disappointed her. Yet Arthur was not finished. But he asked unusual questions. Clara waited. Questions about old estate records, property transfers, historic rights of way. The information immediately caught her attention. Financial irregularities, altered documents, estate records. None of it sounded accidental anymore. After thanking Arthur, Clara continued her search. Throughout the day she spoke with several former employees. Most offered only fragments, small observations, isolated concerns. Yet patterns began emerging. Adrian had been investigating far more than money. Land records, legal archives, historical agreements. Something buried deep within the estate's past had attracted his attention. By late afternoon, Clara sat alone beneath an oak tree overlooking the river. Her notebook rested open on her lap, pages filled with names, dates, and observations. The evidence remained incomplete. Yet a picture was beginning to form. Someone had been manipulating estate records. Not recently. For years. Footsteps approached across the grass. Clara looked up. Adrian emerged from the trees carrying a folded map. Unlike their previous meeting, he wore no disguise beyond a simple traveling coat. The sight of him still felt slightly unreal. She suspected that feeling would persist for some time. "You have been busy," he said. Clara closed the notebook. "So have you." Adrian sat beside her on the fallen log. Not too close. Not distant either. The quiet familiarity surprised her. As though weeks of chaos had not entirely erased years of mutual trust. "What did you learn?" he asked. Clara summarized everything. Arthur Bell's observations. The questions about property records. The unusual surveys. The recurring references to legal documents. Adrian listened carefully. The more she spoke, the darker his expression became. "You were right," he said when she finished. "About what?" "The records." He unfolded the map resting beside him. Clara immediately recognized the estate boundaries. Several locations had been marked in pencil. "What am I looking at?" Adrian pointed toward the northern section. "These parcels technically belong to Blackthorn Hall." Then he pointed elsewhere. "At least they should." Clara frowned. "They do not." Adrian's jaw tightened. On paper, several sections were quietly transferred years ago. Clara stared at the markings. "Without authorization? Without my grandfather's authorization. Without my father's authorization. And certainly without mine." A chill ran through her. The implications were enormous. Land represented wealth, influence, power. Quietly transferring ownership could reshape entire fortunes. "Who benefited?" she asked. Adrian's expression turned grim. "That is what I am trying to prove." Silence settled briefly. The river flowed gently nearby. Birds called from distant trees. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Clara remembered something else. "There is more." Adrian looked at her. She hesitated. "The men who came to the boarding house." His posture immediately sharpened. "What about them?" Mrs. Turner said one seemed interested in the rear entrance. Adrian's expression became unreadable. "I thought so." Clara studied him carefully. "You recognized them." It was not a question. Adrian nodded once. "Not personally." "Then how?" He stared toward the river. "Because they have been asking questions in multiple villages." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "About you. About a survivor." The words landed heavily. Clara remained silent. Adrian continued quietly. "The official story claimed nobody escaped the accident. But someone did." Adrian looked at her. "Yes." The conversation ended there. Neither needed to elaborate. Some truths carried enough weight on their own. As evening approached, they returned toward the village by separate routes. Adrian insisted upon it. Clara disliked the arrangement. Yet she understood the necessity. The fewer people who connected them, the safer both remained. Before departing, Adrian handed her a small brass key. Clara examined it curiously. What is this? Access. To where? For the first time all day, a faint smile touched his face. The old records room beneath Blackthorn Hall. Clara blinked. There is a records room beneath the house? Most people do not know about it. Including Lady Margaret? Adrian's smile faded. I hope so. Clara turned the key over in her hand. And you want me to go there? I need someone inside the estate. The realization struck immediately. A spy. Adrian considered the word. An investigator. That sounds more respectable. It usually does. Despite everything, Clara laughed. The sound surprised both of them. For a brief moment the tension eased. Then reality returned. How exactly am I supposed to enter Blackthorn Hall? Adrian reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document. Mrs. Holloway helped arrange something. Clara opened it. Her eyes widened. Temporary employment authorization. Laundry assistance. 1-week assignment. Signed and approved. You are sending me back as a servant. Adrian nodded. Only temporarily. Clara stared at the paper. The irony was almost unbelievable. Weeks earlier she had been publicly dismissed. Now she would return through the same servant's entrance she once used every day. Except this time she would be searching for secrets. This is a terrible plan, she said. Adrian looked mildly offended. It is a practical plan. Those are not always the same thing. In my experience, they usually are. Clara shook her head. Your experience is questionable. For a second Adrian appeared genuinely amused. Then the expression softened into something quieter. More serious. You do not have to do this. Clara looked at him. The evening light touched the edges of his face. Exhaustion lingered in his features despite his efforts to hide it. He carried more responsibility than anyone realized. More guilt as well. She remembered his apology at the boarding house. The regret in his voice. The sleepless nights he admitted to. Yes, she said softly. I do. Adrian held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. No arguments. No persuasion. Just trust. Felt strangely significant. The next morning Clara stood once again before Blackthorn Hall. Mist drifted across the grounds. The great stone mansion loomed above the landscape exactly as it had on the day she was dismissed. Yet everything felt different now. She was not returning as a victim. She was returning with purpose. Hidden beneath her sleeve rested the brass key. Inside her satchel lay notebooks and copied records. Somewhere within the estate waited answers. As she approached the servant's entrance, the familiar knot of tension tightened in her stomach. A maid opened the door. Recognition flashed across the woman's face. Then surprise. Then relief. Miss Whitfield. Clara smiled politely. Good morning. The maid stepped aside. Mrs. Holloway has been expecting you. Clara crossed the threshold. The door closed quietly behind her. She had returned to Blackthorn Hall. This time, she intended to discover exactly what Lady Margaret was hiding. Returning to a place that had once felt familiar proved stranger than Clara expected. During her years at Blackthorn Hall, she had known every hallway, every staircase, every creaking floorboard. Now the estate felt like a house wearing someone else's face. The routines remained. The architecture remained. Even many of the servants remained. Yet tension lingered beneath everything. It appeared in lowered voices, in cautious glances, in conversations that ended when footsteps approached. Clara spent her first day performing exactly the duties listed in her temporary assignment. Laundry records, linen inventories, storage organization, unremarkable tasks, safe tasks. She worked diligently and attracted as little attention as possible. The strategy paid off. By evening, most of the newer staff had begun treating her as part of the background. Invisible, overlooked. Clara had learned long ago that invisibility could be remarkably useful. Shortly after sunset, Mrs. Holloway found her folding tablecloths in the service corridor. The older housekeeper carried a basket of pressed linens. To anyone watching, their interaction appeared entirely ordinary. "You are settling in well," Mrs. Holloway said. "I have always been adaptable." The housekeeper nodded slightly. "The West Wing is quiet tonight." Clara immediately understood. The statement had nothing to do with housekeeping. "That is good to know." Mrs. Holloway continued walking without another word. Clara finished her work carefully. She waited another hour. Then another. Patience mattered. Rushing invited mistakes. By 10 o'clock, most servants had retired to their quarters. Lamps burned lower throughout the house. Silence gradually replaced activity. Only then did Clara retrieve the brass key hidden inside her sleeve. Her pulse quickened immediately. She crossed the empty corridor and descended a narrow staircase leading toward the older sections of the estate. Few people used this area anymore. Storage rooms occupied most of the lower level. Dust gathered in forgotten corners. Portraits of long-dead ancestors watched from dim walls. Clara moved carefully. The key felt surprisingly heavy in her hand. Adrian had given only the briefest directions. The records room existed beneath the original foundations of the house. Access required locating a concealed door hidden behind a section of shelving. Finding it proved easier than expected. The shelves appeared ancient. One panel carried unusual wear marks near the edge. Clara pressed gently. A faint click echoed through the darkness. The panel shifted inward. A narrow passage appeared beyond. Her heart immediately began racing. She lifted her lantern and stepped through. The hidden room exceeded every expectation. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of ledgers occupied the space. Property records, tax records, contracts, correspondence, generations of estate history preserved beneath the house. Clara stared in astonishment. Good heavens! The room smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Dust covered many surfaces. Clearly few people knew it existed. She immediately began searching. Hours passed. Ledger after ledger. File after file. Most documents proved legitimate. Boring even. Agricultural reports. Rental agreements. Supply inventories. Then shortly after midnight she found something unusual. A collection of land transfer records stored separately from the main archive. Clara carried the files to a table and examined them carefully. Within minutes, her concern returned. Several signatures appeared inconsistent. Not obvious forgeries. Subtle manipulations. Small alterations hidden among legitimate paperwork. The pattern matched everything she and Adrian had already suspected. Estate property had been quietly transferred over many years. The beneficiaries changed repeatedly. Shell companies, distant investors, legal entities that seemed intentionally difficult to trace. Clara copied names and dates into her notebook. Excitement mixed with caution. This was evidence. Real evidence. Yet the deeper she searched, the stranger the documents became. Around 1 in the morning, she discovered a sealed file tucked behind a row of older ledgers. The label contained only a date, 8 years earlier. Curious, she opened it. Her breath caught almost immediately. Inside rested correspondence between Adrian's late father and a physician named Dr. Nathaniel Graves. Several letters discussed private consultations, medical evaluations, confidential concerns. Clara frowned. The contents seemed unrelated to financial fraud. Yet one phrase appeared repeatedly. Protection of succession. She read the words twice, then 3 times. Confusion deepened. Why would succession concerns require secret correspondence? She continued reading. A few pages later, another sentence caught her attention. If circumstances change, the young woman must remain protected regardless of public perception. Clara blinked. The young woman? What young woman? The letters never provided a name. Frustration mounted. She searched the remaining documents. More references appeared. Vague, incomplete, yet impossible to ignore. Someone important had been protecting a woman's future for years. Someone powerful. Someone connected to the Blackthorne family. Clara carefully copied several passages into her notebook. Adrian needed to see them. As she reached for the next letter, a sound echoed somewhere beyond the hidden room. Footsteps. Clara froze instantly. The noise lasted only a moment. Then silence returned. Her pulse hammered. Slowly she extinguished part of the lantern flame and listened. Nothing. Perhaps an old house settling. Perhaps a servant passing nearby. Yet unease remained. She resumed working. 15 minutes later, another sound drifted through the passage. This time unmistakable. Voices. Faint. Distant. But real. Someone was nearby. Clara immediately gathered the documents. She restored everything exactly as she had found it. Then she moved toward the concealed exit. The voices grew clearer. 2 people. 1 male. 1 female. She recognized the woman's voice immediately. Lady Margaret. Clara's heartbeat accelerated. Instinct took over. Rather than leave, she slipped behind a tall, shelving unit near the entrance. Seconds later, the hidden panel opened. Light spilled into the passage. Lady Margaret entered first carrying a lantern. Silas Vane followed. Clara remained perfectly still. "You are certain nobody knows?" Lady Margaret asked. "Nobody should," Silas replied. "Should is not certainty." The older woman's voice carried irritation. "We cannot afford surprises." Clara strained to hear every word. Silas glanced around the archive. The assembly created complications. The maid created complications. Lady Margaret's tone sharpened noticeably. Clara felt her stomach tighten. "She has become a nuisance." "Then dismiss her again." "Not yet." Silence followed. Then Lady Margaret said something that made Clara's blood run cold. "I want to know exactly what she has discovered." Clara remained motionless. Every instinct screamed caution. They suspected her. Perhaps not completely, but enough. Silas moved toward a row of ledgers. "Do you truly believe she knows anything?" Lady Margaret laughed softly. "I believe Adrian trusted her." The statement stunned Clara. Even Lady Margaret had recognized it. That alone makes her dangerous. Silence settled again. Then Lady Margaret changed the subject. "What about the doctor?" Clara's attention sharpened instantly. The doctor. Dr. Nathaniel Graves. The same physician mentioned in the letters. Silas hesitated. Still alive. And cooperative? Reluctantly. Lady Margaret sighed. "I am growing tired of reluctant people." Clara pressed a hand against the shelf to steady herself. The conversation was no longer merely suspicious. It connected directly to the letters she had just found. Lady Margaret continued. "The fewer loose ends, the better." Silas nodded. "I understand." Another silence followed. Then footsteps approached. Closer. Much closer. Clara's pulse surged. Lady Margaret was moving directly toward her side of the archive. One more step and she would become visible. Clara forced herself not to panic. "Think. Breathe. Stay still." The footsteps continued, then stopped, less than 10 feet away. "What is this?" Lady Margaret asked suddenly. Clara's stomach dropped. Had she discovered the disturbed documents? The notebook? Some sign of Clara's presence? Silas moved closer. Papers rustled. An old medical file. Relief nearly overwhelmed her. "Not the notebook. Not yet." "Destroy it," Lady Margaret said. "There is no reason to keep unnecessary records." Clara silently memorized every word. Destroy it. The letters mattered. They mattered enough to frighten Lady Margaret. Moments later, the conversation ended. Footsteps retreated toward the exit. The hidden panel closed. Darkness returned. Clara remained frozen for nearly 5 minutes. Only when absolute silence settled over the archive did she finally move. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, from realization. The letters were important. The physician was important. And somehow, hidden beneath years of secrecy, a woman connected to the Blackthorne family remained important as well. Clara retrieved her notebook. Then she paused. One final document remained on the table. A letter she had not finished reading. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting belonged to Adrian's father. The final paragraph had been partially damaged by age. Yet several lines remained legible. Clara read them once. Then again. Her breath caught. "If anything happens to me, Adrian must never learn the truth before the proper time." The revelation struck like a bell inside her mind. Adrian himself did not know everything. Whatever secret these records protected, it had been hidden from him as well. Clara folded the letter carefully. Dawn was still hours away. Yet she already knew one thing with certainty. The mystery surrounding Blackthorn Hall had just become far more complicated than either she or Adrian imagined. Clara left the hidden archive shortly before dawn with more questions than answers. The estate remained silent around her. Most of Blackthorn Hall still slept beneath layers of stone, velvet curtains, and carefully guarded secrets. She moved through the lower corridors cautiously, carrying only her lantern and notebook. The copied passages rested safely inside her satchel. Every instinct told her they would matter later. By the time she reached her small room in the servants' wing, pale morning light had begun appearing beyond the eastern windows. Sleep proved impossible. She sat on the edge of the bed and reviewed everything she had learned. The forged transfers, the physician, the mysterious young woman, Adrian's father's warning. The puzzle continued expanding rather than shrinking. Somewhere near the center of it all stood Lady Margaret. Clara felt certain of that much. A knock sounded against her door. She immediately slid the notebook beneath a folded blanket. "Come in." Mrs. Holloway entered carrying fresh linens. At least that was the appearance she intended to create. The moment the door closed, concern replaced professionalism. "You were not in your room last night." Clara blinked. "You noticed." The housekeeper gave her a look that suggested the question itself was foolish. "I notice everything." Clara smiled faintly. "That explains how this estate survived for so long." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened. Then it darkened again. "You need to be careful." Clara sat straighter. "Why?" The older woman hesitated. "Because people are asking questions." The warning immediately sharpened Clara's attention. "About me?" Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Particularly Mr. Vane." Unease settled in Clara's chest. "What kind of questions?" "Where you go? Who you speak with? What documents you handled during your previous employment?" Clara remained silent. The concern in Mrs. Holloway's face told her everything she needed to know. Suspicion was growing. "Thank you for telling me. That is not all." Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice further. "Lady Margaret has called a staff review this afternoon." Clara frowned. "For what purpose?" The older woman laughed humorlessly. "Officially? Estate efficiency." Clara immediately understood. The meeting had nothing to do with efficiency. It was about control, about observation, about identifying potential problems. And right now she qualified as one. The hours that followed passed slowly. Clara completed her assigned duties while remaining alert. Everywhere she went, she sensed eyes lingering slightly longer than before. Conversations paused when she approached. Servants who once greeted her warmly now appeared nervous. Not hostile, nervous. Fear had become part of daily life inside Blackthorn Hall. Shortly after 3 o'clock, the staff review began. More than 40 employees gathered in one of the smaller assembly rooms near the rear of the estate. Rows of chairs filled the space. Lady Margaret sat at the front beside Silas Vane. Several supervisors occupied nearby seats. The atmosphere felt tense from the beginning. Clara selected a place near the back. Observation remained easier from the edges. Lady Margaret opened the meeting with remarks about loyalty and professionalism. The speech sounded familiar, almost identical to previous speeches. Responsibility, reputation, service, stability, the same carefully chosen words repeated again and again. Yet beneath the polished language lay something colder. Control. Clara noticed it immediately. So did others. One maid stared at the floor throughout the entire presentation. A footman repeatedly twisted his cap between nervous hands. Nobody seemed comfortable. After 20 minutes, Lady Margaret shifted topics. "Recent events have reminded us of the importance of trust." Clara felt tension ripple through the room. Several servants exchanged uneasy glances. They knew where this was going. Lady Margaret continued. "Unfortunately, trust can be misplaced." Silence followed. Then her gaze settled directly upon Clara. Every servant in the room noticed. So did Clara. The trap had finally appeared. "Some individuals have demonstrated remarkably poor judgment." Lady Margaret's voice remained calm, almost pleasant. "Spreading rumors. questioning legitimate authority, creating unnecessary disruption. Clara remained motionless. Around her nobody breathed, nobody moved. Blackthorn Hall cannot function while disloyalty festers beneath its roof. The accusation hung heavily in the air. Silas Vane watched Clara carefully, waiting, measuring, looking for a reaction. She gave him none. Lady Margaret smiled. "Miss Whitfield." Clara rose slowly. "Yes. Perhaps you would care to explain your recent interest in estate records." The room froze. Several servants looked shocked. Others looked frightened. Clara understood why. Public questioning rarely ended well. She folded her hands calmly. "I work in inventory management." Lady Margaret tilted her head. "That was not my question." "Then perhaps I misunderstood." A few servants lowered their heads to hide faint smiles. Lady Margaret did not smile. Not even slightly. "You seem unusually curious about matters beyond your station." Clara heard a sharp intake of breath somewhere nearby. The insult had been intentional, deliberate, public, exactly the kind of humiliation designed to establish dominance. Yet instead of anger, Clara felt something unexpected. Clarity. Lady Margaret wanted her defensive, emotional, unstable. She refused to cooperate. "Curiosity is not a crime." The response emerged calmly. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. "No, but ambition can become dangerous." Silence settled once more. Clara recognized what was happening. This was not really about records. It was about reputation. Lady Margaret could not openly accuse her without evidence. So she would undermine her credibility instead. Make people doubt her. Make people dismiss her. The realization strengthened her resolve. "I have no ambition regarding this estate," Clara said. "I simply respect the truth." Several heads turned. The statement landed harder than she intended. Lady Margaret's expression cooled noticeably. An admirable sentiment. Her voice suggested otherwise. Then she delivered the next blow. "Although some might question whether a former servant dismissed for theft should lecture others about truth." The room fell silent again. Pain flashed briefly through Clara despite her efforts. Not because the accusation mattered, because so many people had accepted it. Yet before she could respond, something unexpected happened. An elderly groundskeeper rose from his chair. "She never stole anything." Every eye turned toward him. The man immediately looked as though he regretted speaking. Yet he remained standing. "I worked here 22 years, he continued quietly. "Miss Whitfield always acted honorably." Lady Margaret stared at him. Cold surprise flickered across her face. Another voice followed. A maid. Younger. Nervous. "She helped me when my mother was ill." Then another servant spoke. Then another. Small statements. Simple statements. Honest statements. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rebellious. Yet together they created something powerful. Character. Reputation. Truth. Clara felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in her chest. These people were afraid. She knew they were afraid. Yet they spoke anyway. Lady Margaret recognized the shift immediately. Her expression hardened. "This meeting is not a discussion." Silence returned. The servants lowered their gazes once more. The moment passed. Yet the damage had already been done. Doubt now existed where certainty once lived. Lady Margaret stood abruptly. "We are finished here." Chairs scraped against the floor as people rose. Conversations remained absent. Nobody wished to attract further attention. Clara gathered her things quietly. As she moved toward the exit, Silas Vane stepped into her path. His smile contained no warmth. "You enjoy making difficulties." Clara met his gaze. "I enjoy honesty." His expression tightened. "Be careful." The warning carried obvious meaning. Clara refused to retreat. "You first." For a brief moment, irritation flashed openly across his face. Then it disappeared beneath practiced politeness. He stepped aside. Clara left the room. The encounter should have felt like a victory. Instead, unease followed her through the corridors. Something had changed. The confrontation had forced people to choose sides, however subtly. That made everyone more visible, including her. As evening approached, she carried linens toward the west wing. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the distant hills. The estate felt restless, waiting. Halfway down a corridor, she noticed movement outside. A figure stood beyond the garden wall, hidden beneath a dark coat, watching the house. Her pulse quickened instantly. Adrian. He remained partially concealed by trees. Yet she recognized him immediately. For a brief moment their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. He had seen the meeting. Somehow, from outside the estate he had witnessed everything. Clara stopped walking. Across the distance, Adrian remained motionless. His expression revealed almost nothing. Yet something in his posture felt different. More intense. More personal. Then he looked toward the west entrance. His attention sharpened abruptly. Clara followed his gaze. Two men had emerged from a side door. Men she did not recognize. They spoke briefly with Silas before disappearing toward the carriage house. Adrian's focus remained fixed upon them. Investigation, observation, evidence. Even now he continued searching. A strange warmth touched Clara unexpectedly. He had every reason to protect himself, to remain hidden, to stay distant. Yet he kept returning, kept watching, kept searching for answers. Thunder echoed again. Adrian looked back toward the window, toward her. For one brief second, the distance between them seemed smaller than the gardens below. Then he gave the faintest nod. Not a greeting, not a farewell. Recognition, respect, trust. Moments later he vanished into the rain. Clara remained standing by the window long after he disappeared. Because for the first time since all of this began, she understood something important. Lady Margaret feared exposure. Silas feared discovery. But Adrian feared something entirely different. He feared that the people caught in the middle of his battle would pay the price for his mistakes. And after everything she had endured, Clara realized she no longer intended to let him carry that burden alone. The announcement appeared 2 days later. By breakfast, every servant in Blackthorn Hall was discussing it. By noon, every village merchant had heard about it. By evening, invitations were traveling across the county. Lady Margaret had organized a grand morning ball in honor of Adrian Blackthorn. Officially, the event would celebrate his legacy and reassure investors, tenants, and neighboring families that the estate remained stable. Unofficially, Clara suspected a different purpose. The timing was too convenient. Questions about the forged documents continued spreading. Doubts lingered after the assembly. Confidence in Lady Margaret's leadership had begun to weaken. A public spectacle offered an opportunity to reclaim control. Clara stood in the laundry room listening as two maids discussed the preparations. Crystal chandeliers would be polished. Musicians were arriving from the city. Floral arrangements had been ordered. Hundreds of guests were expected. The scale sounded less like a memorial and more like a coronation. That observation remained in her thoughts throughout the day. Shortly before sunset, Mrs. Holloway found her organizing table linens. The older housekeeper carried a ledger beneath one arm. The guest list has expanded again. Clara looked up. How many? Nearly 200. Clara frowned. That seems excessive. I suspect that is the point. Mrs. Holloway lowered her voice. The more witnesses, the stronger Lady Margaret believes her position becomes. Clara understood immediately. Public perception mattered. A crowded ballroom created legitimacy, influence, authority. If enough important people accepted Lady Margaret's version of events, challenging her would become increasingly difficult. Has Mr. Vane been busy? Clara asked. Mrs. Holloway laughed softly. Busier than anyone. The answer was revealing enough. That evening, Clara managed to leave the estate briefly under the pretense of collecting supply records from the village. Instead, she followed the familiar path toward the old riverside clearing where Adrian occasionally arranged meetings. The sun had already disappeared. Twilight painted the landscape in shades of blue and silver. She found him waiting beneath a large oak tree overlooking the water. He appeared tired, more tired than during their previous meeting. Yet the moment he saw her, his attention sharpened completely. Something happened. It was not a question. Clara smiled faintly. You always know. Adrian folded his arms. You only seek me out after sunset when something important occurs. That is annoyingly accurate. The corner of his mouth almost lifted. Almost. Clara quickly explained the upcoming ball. The growing guest list. The atmosphere inside the estate. Adrian listened without interruption. By the time she finished, his expression had become thoughtful. A morning ball. That concerns you? It interests me. Clara studied him. Because? Adrian looked toward the river. Because my aunt dislikes unnecessary risks. Clara immediately understood. You think she is planning something. I think she believes she is close to victory. Silence settled between them. Water moved gently along the riverbank. Somewhere nearby, a night bird called from the trees. Adrian finally reached into his coat and removed several folded papers. I found something. Clara accepted them carefully. The documents contained copies of financial transfers. Names, dates, legal entities. Most appeared unfamiliar. Then one name caught her attention. Dr. Nathaniel Graves. Her pulse quickened. The physician. Adrian nodded. Money moved through accounts connected to him. Clara looked up sharply. Was he involved? I do not know. Adrian's expression darkened. But someone paid him regularly for years. The information aligned perfectly with the letters from the hidden archive. Clara told him everything she had discovered beneath Blackthorn Hall. The secret correspondence. The references to a young woman. His father's warning. The instructions regarding protection. Adrian listened in complete silence. For the first time since she had known him, genuine surprise crossed his face. My father wrote that? Yes. Adrian stared toward the river for several moments. He never mentioned any of it. Clara hesitated. The letter specifically said you were not supposed to know. A humorless smile touched his face. Apparently he succeeded. The response carried more sadness than amusement. Clara felt an unexpected ache in her chest. Adrian had spent weeks discovering betrayals. Yet this felt different. More personal. A secret kept by someone he had trusted completely. Eventually he exhaled slowly. Then we have two mysteries. The estate fraud. And the woman my father wanted protected. Clara nodded. Do you have any idea who she might be? Adrian shook his head. None. Darkness deepened around them. The conversation shifted toward practical matters. Guest arrivals. Estate schedules. Opportunities to gather evidence during the ball. Yet beneath every topic lingered the same truth. Time was running out. Lady Margaret was preparing something. They simply did not know what. 3 days later, Blackthorn Hall transformed. Carriages arrived from dawn until dusk. Florists filled hallways with elaborate arrangements. Musicians rehearsed in the ballroom. Servants rushed through corridors carrying trays, candles, and decorations. The estate had never appeared more magnificent, nor more tense. Clara worked continuously. Every room required preparation. Every guest required accommodation. Every schedule changed hourly. Amid the chaos, she continued observing, watching, listening. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly on the afternoon before the ball. Clara had been carrying fresh linens toward the east wing when she heard raised voices behind a partially open study door. Instinct immediately made her pause. Lady Margaret stood inside. So did Silas Vane. Their conversation sounded unusually strained. It should have arrived already, Lady Margaret said. The courier was delayed. That is not acceptable. Clara edged slightly closer. The voices became clearer. Without it, tomorrow becomes far more difficult. Silas lowered his voice. Clara struggled to hear the response. Only fragments reached her. Doctor. Final record. Proof. Clara's attention sharpened immediately. The doctor again. Dr. Graves. Before she could hear more, footsteps approached from the corridor. Clara quickly resumed walking. Moments later, a maid passed her carrying silverware. The opportunity vanished. Yet the fragments remained. Final record. Proof. Whatever Lady Margaret expected to receive, it mattered. The following evening arrived cold and clear. Hundreds of candles illuminated Blackthorn Hall. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished floors. Elegant guests filled every reception room. Music drifted through the estate. Laughter echoed through hallways. On the surface, the gathering appeared flawless. Beneath that surface, Clara sensed tension everywhere. Lady Margaret moved through the crowd greeting guests with practiced confidence. Silas remained nearby almost constantly. Several unfamiliar men circulated around the estate, watching entrances and corridors with unusual attention. Security, observation, preparation. Clara noticed all of it. She also noticed something else. A black carriage arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Unlike the others, it entered through the side drive rather than the main entrance. One passenger emerged carrying a leather case. Clara recognized him immediately from an old portrait she had found in the archive. Dr. Nathaniel Graves. Her pulse accelerated. The physician looked older than the portrait suggested. White-haired, distinguished, nervous, very nervous. He disappeared into a private sitting room with Lady Margaret and Silas. The meeting lasted nearly 40 minutes. When the doctor finally emerged, he appeared troubled. Clara watched from across the hallway. As he passed, a folded envelope slipped partially from his leather case. Only for a moment, yet it was enough. She recognized the Blackthorn seal. Her heart began pounding. The envelope mattered. Somehow she knew it. The evening continued. Music grew louder. More guests arrived. Conversations filled every corner of the estate. Yet Clara's attention remained fixed upon the physician. Around 10 o'clock, he quietly left the ballroom and headed toward the guest wing. Clara waited 30 seconds before following. The corridor beyond the celebrations stood nearly empty. Candlelight flickered against the walls. Dr. Graves entered a temporary guest chamber and closed the door. Clara slowed outside. Her pulse hammered. This was reckless, dangerous, exactly the sort of decision Adrian would disapprove of, which was probably why she continued. A few minutes later, the physician emerged again and headed downstairs. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Clara slipped into the room. The chamber was modest, neat, temporary. She moved quickly. Desk, luggage, writing case. Then she found it. The leather case rested beside the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Papers filled the interior. Medical records, correspondence, notes. Then she saw the envelope bearing the Blackthorn seal. Carefully, she unfolded the document inside. Her eyes moved across the page. The first line made her breath catch. The second nearly stopped her heart entirely. She read it twice to ensure she understood correctly. Then a third time, because hidden within that document was a truth neither she nor Adrian had ever considered. And if the information was genuine, it changed everything they believed about the mystery surrounding Blackthorn Hall. A sudden sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Returning footsteps. Clara's head snapped toward the door. The physician was coming back. And the document still lay open in her hands. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Clara reacted instinctively. She slid the document back into the envelope, returned it to the leather case, and closed the latch just as the handle began turning. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. There was no time to cross the room, no time to leave. Her gaze landed on a tall wardrobe near the corner. She slipped behind it seconds before the physician entered. Dr. Nathaniel Graves stepped inside carrying a glass of wine. The elderly man closed the door and released a weary sigh. Clara remained perfectly still behind the wardrobe. She could hear every movement, the rustle of papers, the creak of a chair, the soft clink of glass against wood. Most importantly, she could hear the physician speaking quietly to himself. This should have ended years ago. Clara's attention sharpened immediately. The physician opened the leather case. Papers shifted. Several long seconds passed. Then another sigh followed. God forgive us all. The words lingered heavily in the room. Clara waited. Eventually the physician gathered several documents and departed once more. This time she counted to 30 before moving. Then 60. Only when she felt certain the corridor was empty did she emerge. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from the revelation she had just read. The document contained a sealed family record signed by Adrian's father and witnessed by Dr. Graves. According to the record, A young woman had been placed under Blackthorn family protection years earlier following a private arrangement known only to a handful of people. More astonishing still, a trust fund intended for that woman's future had become the target of repeated financial transfers. Suddenly, the estate fraud and the hidden correspondence no longer appeared separate. They were connected, deeply connected. Clara left the room and hurried through the service corridors. She needed to find Adrian immediately. Unfortunately, circumstances had already begun moving faster than either of them anticipated. The morning ball had reached its peak. Music filled the ballroom. Hundreds of candles illuminated crystal chandeliers overhead. Guests laughed and danced beneath gilded ceilings. Servants moved continuously between reception rooms carrying silver trays and refreshments. Yet beneath the elegance, tension vibrated through the estate like an invisible wire. Clara spotted Mrs. Holloway near the west staircase. The older housekeeper immediately noticed her expression. "What happened?" Clara lowered her voice. "I found something important." Mrs. Holloway glanced around carefully. "Can it wait?" "No." The answer came instantly. Before either woman could continue, another voice interrupted. "Miss Whitfield." Clara turned. Silas Vane stood several feet away. His smile appeared polite. His eyes did not. "Lady Margaret wishes to speak with you." Every instinct warned her. Trap, observation, confrontation. Yet refusing would attract even more attention. Clara nodded calmly. "Of course." Silas gestured toward a smaller reception room adjoining the ballroom. "This way." As she followed him through the crowded estate, Clara searched for any sign of Adrian. Nothing. No familiar figure. No discreet signal. No gray eyes watching from the edge of the crowd. Unease deepened with every step. The reception room stood empty except for Lady Margaret. The older woman stood beside a marble fireplace holding a crystal glass. Her expression remained composed, controlled, dangerous. Silas quietly closed the door behind Clara. The sound seemed unusually loud. "Miss Whitfield." Lady Margaret smiled. "Thank you for joining us." Clara folded her hands. "You requested my presence." "Indeed." Silence followed. The older woman studied her carefully. "You have been remarkably active since returning to the estate." Clara remained calm. "I enjoy working." Lady Margaret laughed softly. "Let us not insult each other's intelligence." The warmth vanished from her expression. "What are you looking for?" There it was. Direct. Unmistakable. Clara met her gaze. "I do not understand the question." "I think you do." Lady Margaret stepped closer. "You have spoken with dismissed staff, questioned records, challenged official documents." Her voice lowered. "And tonight you seem particularly interested in Dr. Graves." Clara felt her pulse quicken. She gave no outward reaction. Lady Margaret noticed anyway. "I see." The older woman smiled again. "So I was correct." Silence filled the room. For a moment nobody moved. Then Clara decided something. Fear had accomplished enough. "What are you hiding?" The question surprised both Silas and Lady Margaret. Clara saw it immediately. Neither expected resistance. "Excuse me?" Lady Margaret asked. Clara took a step forward. "You keep asking what I know." Her voice remained steady. "Perhaps the better question is why you are so afraid that someone might learn the truth." The room froze. Silas shifted uncomfortably. Lady Margaret's eyes hardened. "Careful." "Why?" Clara asked quietly. "You dismissed me. You destroyed my reputation. You have spent weeks trying to control every conversation inside this house." She held the older woman's gaze. "People do not work that hard unless they are protecting something." For the first time, genuine anger crossed Lady Margaret's face. Not dramatic anger. Not shouting. Something colder. More revealing. "You have no idea what you are involved in." Clara thought about the hidden archive. The forged transfers. The physician's records. Adrian's father's warning. "Perhaps not," she admitted. "But I am getting closer." Silence followed. Then Lady Margaret unexpectedly smiled. The expression carried no kindness whatsoever. "That is unfortunate." Clara immediately understood. The conversation was over. Whatever came next had already been planned. The door opened behind her. Several guests stood in the hallway. Prominent guests, influential guests, people whose opinions shaped society. Clara frowned. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Then Lady Margaret raised her voice just enough for the newcomers to hear. I have been extraordinarily patient. The performance began instantly. Despite everything, I welcomed you back into this house. Clara stared. The shift was almost impressive. Lady Margaret transformed from angry conspirator into wounded benefactor within seconds. More guests gathered nearby. Curiosity spread quickly. And yet you continue spreading accusations. Murmurs rippled through the hallway. Clara remained silent. She recognized the strategy immediately. Public humiliation. Discredit the messenger. Protect the narrative. Lady Margaret stepped toward the doorway. This estate has endured enough disruption. Her voice trembled slightly. Whether from emotion or calculation, Clara could not tell. I will not allow bitterness to damage my nephew's legacy. More guests arrived. More whispers followed. Clara suddenly found herself at the center of attention once again. Exactly where Lady Margaret wanted her. You accuse honorable people without evidence. Lady Margaret shook her head sadly. I pity you. Several guests nodded sympathetically. Others appeared uncertain. Yet the effect remained obvious. Clara was being isolated. Publicly. Deliberately. Across the corridor, servants watched helplessly. Mrs. Holloway stood near the staircase. Her expression reflected both anger and concern. Silas remained silent, observing, waiting. Clara understood what was happening. Lady Margaret could not stop the investigation entirely, but she could destroy the credibility of the person pursuing it. The realization hurt more than she expected. Not because of the accusations themselves, because the strategy was working. She saw doubt spreading through the crowd, heard it in whispered conversations, felt it in averted eyes. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly gentleman stepped forward. One of the landowners who attended the previous assembly. Actually, he said carefully, Miss Whitfield raised valid concerns regarding those documents. Silence followed. Lady Margaret's expression tightened. Another voice joined. A woman this time. I thought the same. Then another. And another. Not enough to overpower the crowd. Not enough to reverse the moment. Yet enough to prevent complete isolation. Clara felt a sudden rush of gratitude. Truth had defenders after all. Lady Margaret recognized the shift instantly. Her eyes flashed with frustration. Then, before anyone could speak further, a loud sound echoed through the estate. The ballroom doors opened. Music faltered. Conversations stopped. Hundreds of guests turned simultaneously toward the entrance. Silence spread through Blackthorn Hall like a wave. 1 second. 2. 3. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Clara turned with everyone else. Her breath caught. A solitary figure stood in the open doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in formal black evening attire. Candlelight illuminated familiar gray eyes. Familiar features. Familiar authority. For a moment, nobody seemed capable of understanding what they were seeing. Lady Margaret went completely pale. Silas Vane staggered backward. Crystal glasses slipped from nervous hands. Across the ballroom, musicians lowered their instruments. The silence became almost unreal. Adrian Blackthorne stepped into the room. No disguise, no hood, no shadows. The Duke walked calmly through the center of the crowd. Hundreds of eyes followed him. Shock hung visibly across every face. Some guests looked frightened. Others looked astonished. Several appeared convinced they were witnessing a ghost. Adrian never looked toward them. He never looked toward Lady Margaret. He never looked toward Silas. Instead his gaze settled upon Clara, and remained there. The distance between them seemed to disappear entirely. Weeks of uncertainty, weeks of lies, weeks of searching, all reduced to a single moment. Adrian crossed the ballroom without hesitation. The crowd parted automatically. Nobody dared block his path. Nobody dared speak. Finally he stopped beside Clara, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the relief as well. Then he turned toward the stunned assembly. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent room. "I believe," he said calmly, "that several people owe Miss Whitfield an apology." For several seconds after Adrian spoke, nobody moved. Nobody seemed capable of moving. The ballroom remained suspended in absolute silence. Hundreds of guests stared at the man they had buried. Candlelight reflected from crystal chandeliers overhead. Music had ceased entirely. Even the servants appeared frozen. Clara stood beside Adrian, acutely aware of every heartbeat. The atmosphere felt almost unreal. Lady Margaret recovered first. Barely. Her hand tightened around the stem of her crystal glass. The color had drained from her face, yet years of social discipline prevented complete collapse. "Adrian." His name emerged as little more than a whisper. Adrian turned toward her calmly. "Aunt Margaret." The formal tone carried enough distance to make several guests exchange uneasy glances. Lady Margaret attempted a smile. It failed almost immediately. "This is impossible." Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "Clearly not." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through part of the crowd before dying away. Nobody knew how to react. Nobody knew which rules still applied. Lady Margaret took a careful breath. "We mourned you. I am aware. We believed you were dead." Adrian held her gaze. Some people certainly seemed eager to believe it. The words landed with quiet precision. Across the room, Silas Vane shifted uncomfortably. Clara noticed immediately. So did Adrian. Their eyes met briefly. The Duke's expression never changed. Yet something about his stillness suddenly seemed dangerous. Not violent. Certain. The certainty of a man who no longer needed to guess. "Adrian," Lady Margaret said carefully, "perhaps this discussion should occur privately." "No." The answer came instantly. Calm. Absolute. Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. Adrian slowly turned toward the assembled guests. "The events of recent weeks have affected more than my family." His voice carried effortlessly through the room. "They have affected employees, tenants, business partners, and members of this community." He paused. "A public deception deserves a public correction." Several guests nodded immediately. Others watched with growing interest. Lady Margaret's expression hardened. She understood the shift as clearly as anyone. The audience now belonged to Adrian. The ballroom that had been intended to strengthen her authority was becoming a courtroom. Adrian extended a hand toward a nearby servant. "The documents." A footman immediately stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio. Clara blinked in surprise. He had planned this carefully. Far more carefully than she realized. Adrian accepted the portfolio and placed it atop a nearby table. Then he opened it. Silence deepened once more. "Over the past several weeks," he said, "I have reviewed estate records, financial transfers, legal correspondence, and witness statements." He removed several documents. Certain irregularities became impossible to ignore. Lady Margaret laughed softly. The sound carried strain beneath its elegance. "Surely you are not suggesting criminal conduct." Adrian looked directly at her. "I am suggesting documented conduct." Several guests exchanged glances. The distinction was devastating. Adrian lifted the first document. Unauthorized property transfers. Then another. Altered estate records. Then another. Forged administrative declarations. Each paper landed upon the table with deliberate precision. The growing stack became impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, Dr. Nathaniel Graves lowered his gaze. Clara noticed immediately. So did Adrian. "Doctor." The physician looked up slowly. "Your Grace." Adrian's tone softened slightly. "Would you care to explain your involvement?" Every eye in the room shifted toward the elderly man. Dr. Graves appeared exhausted. Not frightened. Tired. As though carrying a burden for far too long. For several seconds he remained silent. Then he set down his glass. "I never intended harm." The confession rippled through the crowd. Lady Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Just briefly. It was enough. Dr. Graves continued. "Years ago, Lord Blackthorne entrusted me with confidential family matters." Clara felt her pulse quicken. The hidden letters. The mysterious young woman. Everything was finally converging. Adrian nodded once. And the trust fund? The physician looked toward Lady Margaret, then back toward Adrian. Repeated withdrawals were authorized under false pretenses. Audible gasps spread through the room. Lady Margaret stepped forward immediately. That is absurd. Dr. Graves shook his head. No. His voice carried unexpected strength. It is documented. Silence followed. The physician removed several folded papers from his pocket and handed them to Adrian. The Duke examined them briefly before placing them atop the growing stack. Evidence. Real evidence. Public evidence. Lady Margaret's composure began to crack visibly. You cannot possibly believe this nonsense. Adrian's gaze remained steady. I believe records. I believe signatures. I believe bank transfers. He paused. And I believe patterns. Across the ballroom, Silas Vane quietly moved toward the exit. Clara noticed first, then Adrian. Mr. Vane. The single statement stopped him instantly. The steward froze. Every guest turned. Adrian regarded him calmly. Leaving already? Silas forced a smile. I merely wished to avoid causing a disturbance. An admirable goal. Adrian folded one document carefully. You should have considered it earlier. Several guests openly laughed this time. Silas looked as though he wished the floor would open beneath him. Then Adrian reached for the final envelope. Clara recognized it immediately. The family record from Dr. Graves' room. The document that had changed everything. Adrian unfolded it slowly. His expression shifted. Not shock. Recognition. Understanding. For the first time, Clara realized he had already seen it. There is one final matter, he said quietly. The ballroom fell silent again. Adrian looked toward Dr. Graves. My father believed a young woman deserved protection. The physician nodded. Yes. Adrian turned toward the crowd. He established a trust fund for her future. Funds which later became the target of systematic theft. Murmurs spread rapidly. Curiosity replaced outrage. A new mystery had appeared. Lady Margaret looked increasingly desperate. This is irrelevant. Adrian ignored her completely. His attention moved across the ballroom, then settled on Clara. The moment felt strangely intimate despite the hundreds of witnesses. Clara's breath caught. Adrian's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Not as a duke. Not as an investigator. As a man carrying a truth he could no longer keep hidden. For weeks, he said quietly. Many people have questioned Miss Whitfield's motives. The ballroom became perfectly still. Clara felt every eye turning toward her once again. Adrian continued. They questioned her character. His voice remained calm. They questioned her integrity. Another pause. Some questioned her loyalty. The words carried weight because everyone knew they were true. Clara had endured all of it. The accusations, the whispers, the humiliation. Adrian's gaze never left hers. Allow me to clarify something. The silence deepened. When I disappeared, nearly everyone accepted the story they were given. He glanced briefly toward Lady Margaret and Silas. Many people found it convenient. Then his attention returned to Clara. Miss Whitfield did not. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in Clara's chest. Adrian continued. She searched for answers when others accepted lies. The ballroom remained utterly silent. She defended this estate when it no longer benefited her. Another pause. She protected my reputation after her own had been destroyed. Clara felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. She refused to let them fall. Adrian was not finished. His voice grew quieter, more personal. And she remained loyal when loyalty carried consequences. The words settled across the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Finally, Adrian turned toward the assembled guests. You wish to know who acted honorably during this entire affair? His gaze swept across the ballroom. Not the people with titles. Then toward Lady Margaret. Not the people with influence. Then toward the evidence covering the table. Certainly not the people with control of the estate. He looked back at Clara. The person who acted with honor was the woman you dismissed as merely a servant. Complete silence followed. Clara could not breathe, could not think. Weeks of humiliation seemed to unravel all at once. The whispers, the accusations, the isolation, every cruel assumption, every unfair judgment. Adrian had not simply defended her. He had returned her dignity in front of everyone who had witnessed its loss. Lady Margaret appeared as though she might shatter. "This is absurd." Her voice sounded thin now, weak. "You are choosing her over your own family." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he answered quietly, "Family is defined by loyalty." The statement struck harder than any accusation. Lady Margaret said nothing. She could not. Across the ballroom, guests began speaking among themselves. Not whispers anymore. Open conversations. Open judgments. The tide had turned completely. Adrian stepped away from the evidence table and crossed the remaining distance toward Clara. The movement drew every eye in the room. He stopped beside her, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "I should have returned sooner." Clara looked up at him. All the frustration, all the anger, all the uncertainty. Somehow none of it seemed important in that moment. Probably. A faint smile touched his face. The first genuine smile she had seen from him since this began. Then, before the entire ballroom, Adrian offered her his hand. Not as a servant, not as an employee, not as someone beneath him, as an equal worthy of respect. Clara looked at the offered hand, then at the hundreds of people watching. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, and for the first time since she had been accused, dismissed, and publicly humiliated, nobody in the room could pretend she was invisible. The ballroom remained alive with conversation long after Clara placed her hand in Adrian's. Yet the tone had changed completely. The whispers that once carried suspicion now carried admiration. Guests who had avoided her eyes only hours earlier now approached with awkward apologies and carefully chosen words. Some seemed sincere. Others merely wished to stand on the correct side of history. Clara accepted both with quiet grace. She had learned that people often revealed themselves most clearly when circumstances changed. Near midnight, the gathering finally began to dissolve. Carriages departed beneath moonlit skies. Musicians packed away instruments. Servants extinguished candles throughout the estate. Blackthorn Hall slowly exhaled after weeks of tension. Clara stood alone for a moment near one of the tall ballroom windows. The gardens beyond shimmered beneath silver light. Her reflection stared back at her. For the first time in a very long while, she did not recognize the woman looking back. Not because she had changed completely, because she had finally stopped seeing herself through other people's judgments. "You disappeared." Adrian's voice came from behind her. Clara turned. The ballroom had nearly emptied. Only a handful of staff remained. Adrian stood a few feet away, no longer surrounded by guests or evidence or expectations. Simply a man who looked more tired than triumphant. "I needed a moment." He nodded as though he understood. "Reasonable." Silence settled comfortably between them, the kind that required no effort. Eventually Clara glanced toward the nearly empty room. "You caused quite a disturbance." A faint smile touched his face. "So I have been told." Several people looked ready to faint, including my aunt. Clara should not have laughed. She did anyway. The sound surprised both of them. Adrian's expression softened. The sight affected her more than she expected. For weeks she had seen him burdened by responsibility, secrecy, and guilt. Now, for the first time, some of that weight seemed lighter. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Adrian looked around the ballroom. "Tomorrow begins several months of legal complications." "That sounds unpleasant." "Extremely." His tone remained perfectly serious. Clara smiled despite herself. Adrian's gaze drifted toward the windows. "The estate records will be reviewed. The transfers reversed where possible. Several individuals will face investigations." He paused. "Blackthorn Hall will survive." The statement carried deeper meaning than the words alone. Clara understood. The estate had been more than property to him, more than wealth. It represented generations of responsibility. Protecting it had never been about power. It had been about stewardship. "And Lady Margaret?" Adrian's expression became thoughtful rather than angry. "She will live comfortably." Clara blinked. "That is generous." "No." He shook his head. "It is practical. She studied him carefully. You are not seeking revenge. Revenge rarely repairs anything. The answer sounded exactly like Adrian. Measured. Controlled. Yet beneath the restraint, Clara sensed disappointment. Family betrayal left wounds that anger could not easily reach. The following morning brought sunlight. Real sunlight. The first truly beautiful day in weeks. News of Adrian's return spread across the county with astonishing speed. By noon, merchants discussed it. By evening, neighboring estates had sent letters. The dead Duke had returned. The scandal dominated every conversation. Yet within Blackthorn Hall a different transformation occurred. Staff members who had spent weeks walking on eggshells gradually relaxed. Laughter returned to servant corridors. Smiles appeared where anxiety once lingered. Even the house itself seemed brighter. Clara remained at the estate for several days helping organize records and answer questions regarding the investigation. She worked alongside Adrian more often than either of them anticipated. Not because they planned it, because practical necessity repeatedly placed them in the same room. The hidden archive required review. Financial records needed sorting. Witness statements demanded organization. Their conversations became easier, more natural. They discussed evidence, estate matters, village news, books, weather, everything and nothing. Yet beneath those ordinary exchanges, something continued growing quietly. Trust had become familiarity. Familiarity was becoming something more difficult to define. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the ball, Clara stood in the library reviewing old correspondence when Adrian entered carrying a small wooden box. I found something. Clara looked up. Another secret archive? Fortunately not. He placed the box on the table. Curiosity immediately appeared in her eyes. Adrian noticed. Open it. Clara lifted the lid carefully. Inside rested several documents along with a velvet pouch. She examined the papers first. Then realization struck. My wages. Adrian nodded. All of them. Clara stared at the figures. Every missed payment. Every withheld amount. Every expense connected to her wrongful dismissal. The total exceeded anything she expected. This is too much. No. Adrian folded his arms. It is exactly enough. Clara looked at him. You did not have to do this. Actually, I did. The answer came immediately. The estate wronged you. She lowered her gaze toward the box. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in her chest. Not because of the money, because someone had finally acknowledged the injustice. Fully. Without excuses. Without conditions. Adrian waited quietly, giving her space, giving her dignity. It was one of the things she admired most about him. Several days later, Clara made a decision that surprised nearly everyone, including Adrian. She chose to leave Blackthorn Hall. Temporarily. The announcement occurred during a quiet afternoon in the garden. Roses bloomed along the stone paths. Bees drifted lazily among late summer flowers. Adrian listened without interruption. You are leaving. Clara nodded. For a little while. Why? She considered the question carefully. Because I spent years defining myself through service. Adrian remained silent. She appreciated that. Then I spent weeks defining myself through survival. A faint breeze stirred the garden around them. I would like to discover who I am beyond both. Adrian looked toward the roses, then back at her. That is a good reason. Relief appeared unexpectedly. Clara had feared he might argue. Instead, he understood immediately. Most people think I am making a mistake. Most people are not you. The answer made her smile. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded paper. What is this? An address. Clara unfolded it. A small seaside cottage approximately 70 miles from the estate. Beautiful coastline. Quiet village. Modest rent. You planned this. Adrian's expression remained innocent. Entirely too innocent. I may have prepared for the possibility. Clara laughed. You are impossible. That is not the first time I have heard that. 3 months passed. Autumn arrived. The seaside village proved exactly what Clara needed. Peaceful mornings. Long walks along the shore. Salt air. Endless horizons. For the first time in years, nobody expected anything from her. She read books, helped at the local school, learned to paint badly, then slightly less badly. Most importantly, she learned to breathe again. Adrian wrote occasionally, never excessively, never intrusively. Short letters, updates about the estate, news about Mrs. Holloway, stories from the village. Clara replied when she wished. The correspondence developed naturally. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people learning how to know each other outside crisis and chaos. On a bright afternoon in early spring, Clara returned from the shoreline carrying a basket of wildflowers. The cottage stood overlooking the ocean. Waves rolled against distant cliffs. Seagulls drifted across clear skies. As she approached the gate, she noticed a familiar horse tied beside the fence. Her pulse quickened instantly. Adrian stood near the garden path. Sunlight illuminated his dark coat. Wind moved through his hair. For a moment neither spoke. The months apart seemed to disappear entirely. "You found the place." Clara set down the basket. Adrian glanced toward the cottage. The directions were excellent. "I suspected they might be." A smile appeared briefly, then faded into something more serious. Adrian stepped forward. Not as a duke approaching a servant. Not as an employer approaching an employee. Simply as a man approaching a woman whose absence he had felt every day. "The estate is stable," he said. "The investigations are complete." Clara waited quietly. "Mrs. Holloway continues managing everything better than I do." "That sounds accurate." Adrian nodded. "Probably." Silence followed. Comfortable. Familiar. Then he took a slow breath. "There is one matter still unresolved." Clara's heart immediately began racing. "Only one. The most important one." His voice softened. "At least to me." The ocean wind carried away the final traces of uncertainty. Adrian looked directly at her. "No titles. No performance. No audience. I came here prepared to offer you complete freedom." Clara blinked. "Freedom. A house anywhere you wish. Financial independence. Anything necessary to ensure your future remains entirely your own." She stared at him. "That sounds suspiciously formal." It was the responsible speech. Clara smiled. "And now?" Adrian's gray eyes never left hers. "Now comes the honest one." The world seemed to narrow until only the two of them remained. Ocean, sky, wind, everything else faded away. "I do not want you to return because you feel obligated." His voice remained steady despite the emotion beneath it. "I do not want gratitude." Another step forward. "I do not want loyalty earned through circumstance." Clara felt tears gathering despite herself. Adrian continued quietly. "I want the chance to spend the rest of my life with the woman who searched for the truth when everyone else accepted lies." Her breath caught. "The woman who challenged me when I deserved it." Another pause. "The woman who taught me that trust is not something granted by titles." The ocean crashed gently against distant rocks. "Clara Whitfield." His voice softened even further. "Will you marry me?" For several seconds she could not answer. Not because she lacked certainty. Because the moment carried everything that had brought them there. The accusations. The dismissal. The loneliness. The investigation. The courage. The trust. Every step of the journey. Finally she smiled through tears she no longer bothered hiding. "Yes." The words seemed to brighten the entire world. Relief crossed Adrian's face first. Then joy. Real joy. Unrestrained and rare. He took her hands gently. No grand gesture. No audience. No performance. Just honesty. Exactly what both of them had spent months fighting to protect. 6 months later, Clara returned to Blackthorn Hall. Not through the servants' entrance. Not carrying laundry lists or inventory ledgers. The front doors stood open beneath a brilliant summer sky. Staff lined the entrance hall. Villagers gathered beyond the gates. Friends filled the gardens. As she stepped across the threshold beside Adrian, applause echoed through the estate. Mrs. Holloway openly cried. Mrs. Turner looked impossibly proud. Even Arthur Bell pretended to wipe dust from his eyes. Clara paused in the center of the entrance hall. The same place where she had once been accused. The same place where she had once stood alone. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Laughter filled the air. Around her stood people who now knew the truth. Adrian offered his arm. Clara accepted it with a smile. Together they walked toward the grand staircase. Not because she had become someone else. Not because she needed validation from society. But because she had finally received what should never have been taken from her in the first place. Respect, trust, love. And as Blackthorn Hall welcomed her home, no one saw a dismissed maid. They saw the woman the Duke had come back for.